Bob, we were talking behind your back a little bit yesterday. I don't think Joe is going to fess up to much of it. It's mostly me. Anyway, we had some fun, not at your expense, but evangelizing you a little bit.
Oh,
Anyhow, I've had so much fun watching things go on in your life in the years that we've been acquainted, and I don't get out to Seattle much. I should. You're operating actually out of Port Towns. Where do you operate from?
well, I'm an hour, depending on traffic, an hour to an hour and a half's drive north of Seattle on a body of water called Port Susan. That's part of Puget Sound.
Okay.
And I look across the bay at Camano Island, and over Camano Island is Whidbey Island, where they have a big naval air station. And this is one of those places you'd never go by here unless you were going here. You know, I'm not on the way anywhere.
I used to talk to some retired naval officer from up there that seemed to hook up with me from time to time years and years ago. I don't even recall his name. And yeah, I didn't spend much time up there. I went up there to visit with David Vicanti when you helped me get in touch with him back when he was bringing his software on stream and you were beginning to use it. Do you use his software anymore or continue to?
I don't use his anymore.
What do you use?
Well, I have I've been working with a guy in Alabama called Jody Colbert III, and he takes my 2D drawings.
Oh yeah.
And makes them into 3D models, right?
Right.
If I'm doing a keel, I just say, here's the profile I want, and here's the foil I want.
I got you.
And he'll create a bulb and do all that work in 3D.
Yeah.
The builders want those files these days.
Right. Some of the friends that I associate with around this neck of the woods use Rhino for that, and
yeah, he uses Rhino and Orca.
Right.
Yeah.
I used for quite a while the thing that the Australians came up with, multi-surf, max surf.
Yeah.
That was a very good program.
Yeah, that became pretty dominant.
Yeah. And then it got so expensive to hang on to it. And I wasn't doing much work at the time, so I just continued to use David's when I was doing anything. But we used Rhino for the work I was doing on high speed, high altitude, high speed, small fixed wing drones. But that world I stepped aside from just the last several months. Those guys are working away on it.
I didn't know you did that work. That sounds interesting.
Well, it was all basic fluid mechanics, and it's just the shape and form of what's the fuselage, what's the wing look like. If the wing is a keel, and it was easy to do, but it was all electrically operated, and the magic mathematics that are used to describe I think they call it quaternion mathematics, but describe the trajectory through 3D over time, so that they were manipulated by onboard inertial guidance methodologies and so on. But anyhow,
sounds complicated.
Well, it's pretty straightforward. You'd be perfectly at home dealing with any of it, except maybe not the mathematics, because it's stuff that was invented in 1700s, but is applied now for guidance methodologies and systems, which was important to have onboard relatively safe from intrusion by outside forces to interrupt the control is by using electric power that is pre-programmed on board. It was less vulnerable, but now with the electromagnetic bursts, where they can kill almost anything, the electric engines are, very vulnerable to that.
How did you get involved in that?
Well, Bob, thought I was going to be an aeronautical guy until I got crazy about boats, and I was telling Joe that my mother just could not believe that I took off on this boat tangent, and of course I got into that, as a teenager sailing and the aerodynamic side of sales, and the next thing I know, I quit engineering at the telephone company and went into sailmaking. And deeper I got into that, she said, "Son, there are other things in this world besides sailboats. You were like a guitar with one string." When I left the telephone company, she says, son, they never laid anybody off during the Depression. What are you doing? What are you doing? Well, I was born in a depression, so I didn't know anything about what was bugging her, but they were very sensitive to it, of course.
Yeah, I think it took years for my parents to sort of admit that I had a real job.
Yeah, me too.
I finally went over there to visit, and I noticed on their coffee table they had one of my books, the Sailing Magazine compilations of my reviews.
Yep.
And they would never say anything or give me any compliments or any kind of kudos for what I'd done. But I saw that book and I thought, all right, that's enough.
Well, my dad encouraged me all the time. He was not a technical guy. And he worked for Firestone Tire and Rubber Company for 22 years, and then continued in that field. And he was during the war, he had a job that was related to ensuring the distribution of the product that came from Firestone, to deliver it to the military, the food industry, and other critical services, so that the commercial vehicles, trucks, and ambulances, things like that, got their share of the automobile tires. And so that he was elevated from a territorial sales representative for Firestone to their representative to redistribute the deliveries of during the war. This was all during wartime.
And he was in Florida at that time?
Yeah, right here in Tampa Bay area. And I was raised in Tampa and moved over here at 53 to get full-time into the sailmaking business and move away from my mother haunting me with all of her admonitions about where are you going with this thing. But anyhow.
Who did you start with in the sailmaking business?
Well, I got to spending summers when I was in high school, apprenticed to a guy named Clinton Johnson, who ran a shipyard up the Hillsborough River here, and holidays and so on. But he was not inclined to take care of his paperwork, like sending out quotations and that type of thing. And there was an old Underwood typewriter in the part of the machine shop that, and I would lay out his sales. I was, by that time, I don't think we've had a chance to talk about it, but I learned in the 7th grade mechanical drawing, and I was good at it. And I always elevated that capability when I had a chance. Everything was hand drawn, of course, in those days. I know you came up from that same slot. And so I had got early on a set of Deatskin drawing instruments, and my father had, when I was born, was working for Eugene Dietzken engineering company, engineering instrument company, I guess it was called at the time, in Chicago. And I was born in Chicago during a blizzard in November 29. And he lost that job in the ensuing depression, came back to Florida and found a job with Firestone, and hung on to that for a very long time. So I got introduced to mechanical drawing and French's book on descriptive geometry, or whatever it was, and the guy that invented French curves and that stuff. And I early on had access to those things. But I was nuts about airplanes and didn't get involved in sailing except by a couple of occasions around 10 years old, 12 years old, over sailing on a lake in Orlando during the war, early days of the war, or just before Pearl Harbor, I guess.
And how old were you then? Pearl Harbor?
Pearl Harbor, I would have been about 14. I'm 92 in November. And you must be what?
75.
75. So I sailed with so many guys with my crew members on ocean racing, that type of thing. But the sailmaking, how I got into sailmaking was I worked for that fellow on different occasions, and I helped make the sails for a little Alden yawl, 36-foot Alden yawl called Redbird, that I went down to Cuba on in about, while I was just winding up high school. And I had laid those sails out. I could do that easy. I could walk in and lay out full-size sail plan from some designer's sail plan on the loft floor, and put the curves in and everything that was needed. It was all cotton by those days. So I've had the experience of going through the cotton and into the early day synthetic materials of those godforsaken days when we had terrible fabrics, but they didn't rot and mildew, which was a big problem here in Florida, where the stitching failed because of the sunlight, all those other problems. But I left the telephone company and had been tuning up boats and working on the CCA handicap ratings for these different boats that were going to Havana and racing up and down the coast here, and got involved in all that sort of thing. And I was sort of speed doctoring boats that had been hanging out of all sorts during the war and waiting for the war to be over. So I was kind of a sharpshooter at the time, just as a kid that was single and running around sailing all the time, sailing small boats. And I just got the idea that I'd buy a sewing machine and start making sails. Came over to St. Pete, so I didn't have to compete directly with the guy that I learned sail making from. And there was so much handwork in those days, and compared to today, the transition into a reliable sail fabric and woven styles or methodologies to make a useful sail making material that didn't overstretch and so on. God, I remember Johnson had made I think it was called Fortisand spinnaker that when it got wet, it was just like toilet paper, and it just blew away in the night on a night race. But we went through all of that hullabaloo. And then I, of course, was racing small sailboats around here and started making sails for them. And
how many years did you diddle around with those fabrics before you had a reliable Dacron?
Well, it took us, we went through nylon, Dacron, Fortisand, did I say Orlan? That was pretty good. It was, but it gave up quickly. So built a lot of thistle sails out of that won races and then quit winning races. And this is way before the so-called high performance materials came out. But the first sails that I remember that were really racing sails came from a German 6-meter that somebody brought in to have recut to use on some old boat that had been built before World War II, and it's good canvas. But it was long ago and far away. And this would have been the year, those years, I went down to Cuba about 1947 or 48. Can't remember which was the first time. The war ended. The Cuba race, which was famous from before the war, we had the Cuba race started in about 33, and that was re-inaugurated. And there were 5 clubs in Havana or in Cuba that participated in the early days of the pre-war SORC activities, which included the Miami-Nassau race and the Lipton races off of Miami. And famous architect down there you may have gotten to know was Worth Monroe, although he died probably about the time you were getting going at Bill Monroe.
I know that name, yeah.
Well, he was very kind to me, and he built some very successful cruiser racers under the CCA rule, which everything I did in the beginning was naval architecture wise, or yacht design, was all associated with the cruising club style of boats. I remember the radical boats were Hoot Mon and
Oh yeah.
remember Hoot Mon?
Oh yeah. I mean, I remember as a kid thinking, God, what an ugly boat.
Well, it was, Woody Perry out of Chicago and Jack Price and a couple of other guys, plus Worth Brown, built that thing. And the first year they were hotshot sailors. Charley Morgan was in there. He was a sailmaker. And they brought her up here.
Who drew that?
I don't know. What must have been the people that got together on that. The only one would have been Worth Brown, who anyway, they came up here and they won a few races of this so-called circuit at the time, which was being re-inaugurated after the war. And so I went down to Miami trying to sell a sail. I was running all over the countryside trying to make a deck awning a sail or anything. I was suffering. I used to tell people, they'd ask me, how you doing? I said, well, I'm just suffering profitless prosperity as a sailmaker here. Anyhow, I went to Miami frequently, and I was invited to stay at Monroe's home, the Barnacle, which was so famous in the early days of Coconut Grove. Miami was then called, earlier on, had been called Lemon City. Would you believe that? Anyhow, he said, Charlie, come. We won't go to lunch at the house. I would sit there at Mary Monroe's kitchen table and talk boats with him. And he said, we got to go. They're going to change the keel on Hoot Mon. I said, really? And he says, yeah, they're going to cut the bottom out of it. I said, what? So we get there on the bank of the Miami River. There she was, all blocked up, and they had scaffolding set up around her. And I was talking to Reed Ruggles about that. You may know Reed. I'm not sure. He was a starboard sailor. And anyway, he was a contractor. I get there and Reed hands up to Worth Monroe a worm drive circle saw, skill saw, big thing, contractor's rig. And he got up on that damn scaffold and went around the boot stripe and cut the bottom of that boat loose right before our very eyes and drug the keel and the bottom out from under her. And I don't know how they did it, but she was strip plank, by the way. Oh. And built a new bottom in her, a new keel. She came up there and tore them up again. A lot faster boat, but she towed a quarter wave you would not believe. And
that was pretty light, though.
The original hull did.
Wasn't it very light?
She was pretty light. Yeah, quite light.
And kind of almost like a real scow-like shape, wasn't it?
It was like an old Sonder boat type of hull with a little bit more freeboard and a cabin, and the cockpit was big enough for people to swap sides and do things and, manage a boat in an ocean race. And she had a big mainsail, pretty good sized mizzen, big mizzen staysail, and about a 3/4 jumper strut, spendable running backstays, just looked like a starboat rig right off the get-go. And so anyway,
It was a sloop, not a yawl.
no, she was a yawl.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, that's right.
I called it a catch yawl, like Paper Tiger was.
The sad thing is, there's very few photographs of Hoot Mon still.
Well, I'll be happy to send you. I've got 2, I think. And
the 2 I've seen. But I'd like to see him because
yeah, well, you make a note of what I promise you, because you'll have to remind me. I'm 82 years old practically. I get myself in trouble promising. But
okay, Joe, you remind me what I'm supposed to remind Charlie of, okay?
of course.
Chain of command.
Oh God. But anyway, but that was a shot across the bows of the CCA rule, So the next thing I know, after I got out Paper Tiger and Sabre and got going, they got me on the rules committee, so they wanted to keep me close to their chest, as they were jumping all over Billy Lapworth for light boats. And Bill Tripp and I used to get up in the meetings and defend him and say, we've got to recognize that with the new construction mediums, which was a line out of my brochures of the day, the last decade's most exciting new construction medium was fiberglass. And we had to recognize these things, and they were coming on, and they just were resolute in trying to beat him down with penalizing light displacement. And I said, why do we do that?
What was Bill Tripp like?
Well, Bill was a very well trained naval architect. He was out there and thought a lot about things that weren't being thought about, like more effective underbody shapes of foils and that type of thing. Took a long time for it to make sense and understand the aspects of an appropriate underbody and the leeway angle. That was, everybody was worrying about that. But he came up, he and Worth Monroe came up with the shoal draft jackknife blade center bores below the soles that would not intrude into the cabin. And I mean, you go down aboard, let's say finished air, you had a centerboard case right in the middle of the salon.
Yeah. So on those high aspect ratio boards like Paper Tiger, what did you do for a foil on the board?
Well, we used for so-called turbulent airfoils, the 2300 series was a good choice, but we weren't trying to get ballast into those, and so the type of foils of 2300 series or others, the 63 series, you could get a good load of lead into those boards. Were only weighted with enough to get them to sink against the drag. Sure. Mine's right over there on the shelf.
Yeah, right.
And thank goodness for the Germans for porting the early airfoil programs over to a PC based. My God, remember some of those foils were carried up five decimal points to the right, and were it was like putting in punch card data and it was all designed for mainframes until they got it ported over. Then it never got cleaned up till guys like Vacanti came along and others that were rewriting those codes and to much more powerful.
Well, the first keel design drawings I ever saw where it was laid out like a wing were done by Ben Seaborn.
Yeah, right,
He had a bunch of clients who worked for Boeing.
right.
I always assumed there was some trickle down from these Boeing engineers. Here's how you lay out a fin.
Right.
But that was all well and fine, but he was using a really fine leading edge,
Yeah.
which of course doesn't really work. But you know, he was definitely looking at the keel like it was a wing and laying it out by percentages of the chord.
Right. And I did a lot of that when I was thinking of what the shape should be or ought to be. But I was working on different foils for the jackknife centerboard, different foils for the rudder, because I was studying. I knew, I can't say his name now, what International 14 sailor that was into sailplanes and was so successful. And he was using, who?
Bruce Kirby?
No, I knew Bruce, bless his heart, he's gone. Yeah, Bruce and I were friends, but no, this was a sailplane guy that I can't say his name right now.
Oh, Bergstrom Ritter?
Well, those guys, no, they were very thorough aerodynamicists. I knew.
Wasn't one of those guys a sailplane guy?
Yeah, but the sailplane airfoil designers were Epler and the other one who used Epler used more rounded foils with noses, and they began to understand the discrepancies of the radius geometry used by NASA or NACA. But the other guy, Felix, I'll tell you his name in a minute. But anyway, he used relatively sharp leading edges, very nervous types of foils that you could wrap on. I did wind tunnel testing out at Wichita State and the Beechcraft Tunnel there. And my 1-ton keels were all done in there. We call them the Wichita keels, and learned a lot there. And then I did some wind tunnel testing up at Stevens Institute in the small wind tunnel that they had there. We got nothing that was quantitative, but it was qualitative, and it led to the type of rear end that we use on Rage and some CCA boats, and Carter was used that back in that day. I forget who was running the tunnel, but
Guys, I got 3 after too. I don't know if you want to open up the floodgates here.
beg pardon.
I got 3 after. Got some guys in the waiting room.
Sure.
Well, we could
Just
just
waiting
talk
for a
about
moment to interject, but I didn't want to.
Yeah, I think that's a good to keep us on track, because I know that I found a live one here at Bob. We'll talk forever.
You listen to you guys for hours, but I don't think that would be fair to the rest of the
So
crew.
Charlie,
Yes, sir.
what was Bill Tripp doing with those big fat bow radiuses he used?
The bow radiuses.
Yeah, they were huge.
Well, they were working on things. Olin Stevens was doing the same thing. I got to know Olin in '62 when I sailed on Columbia. I built sails for her. And Olin sent me an underwater photograph of the stagnation point at low speeds in the tank test. And they were looking at that stagnation point from aerodynamic standpoints. And what was really going on is if the leeway angle is, say, 4 to 6 degrees or so, you have induced drag over the sharper types of bows. And I understood that pretty early on myself, and it made a big difference in I'm gonna turn my phone off because that damn thing will go off in the middle of our talk. So anyhow, the once we were able to analyze in the PC computer the airfoil in different flow fields, in other words, different Reynolds numbers and all of that, we began to see that you needed a wide low drag bucket. And, and so people that were uninitiated, or if you ask what's a good low drag section, well, everybody thinking is a streamline like the tail feathers on an aircraft. And Felix developed an airfoil, for instance, for rudders, for sailplanes, that you could have a coefficient lift of 0.4 or 5, 6 beyond neutral without increasing the drag bucket. So the drag bucket was wide and you could always be operating as you're tucking it in and thermaling up in a spiral. Right. Yeah, that'd be a 10% section or something like that. Those are okay for rudders, but Felix have developed a sailplane version, more higher aspect ratio. All those things got into it. And anyway, I did use pretty fat underwater sections for Paper Tiger, but Paper Tiger was not particularly extraordinary boat. She had a short rig, therefore a low rating. She was a little wider than the Finisterre type boats that were out, and she was heavily built, and her first 2 seasons were in high wind velocity parts of the year. So
we had that big pipe frame running down the middle of the boat.
Well, that pipe frame was, you want to know why that pipe frame was there?
Well,
It's not.
yeah, I do.
Well, yeah, but you would understand it. I mean, this was one of the very first ocean racers that had been hand laminated over a male plug, faired hull, and who knew in those days we had Mickey Mouse resins, bad catalysts, and so I was worried like hell about hitting something and carving in the bow and going down like a shot before you could even get your foul weather, your safety gear out. So that was the solution to that. She had laminated Western yellow cedar, what do they call it? Western yellow cedar, or Alaskan yellow cedar, for her shear clamps, which bolted the decks down and bolted the sail tracks down and bolted the stanchions down and all of that. It was a heavy boat. Was
there any rating advantage under the CCA to have that pipe?
No, it was lightweight, scheduled a lightweight schedule. It was not heavy at all.
I mean, okay, here's another question. On Finisterre, those big centerboards, did they have any foil shape to them, or were they just
No,
big,
they were flat plates.
big
They were flat bronze plates. She had a bronze sand shoe that went down her fore gripe all the way down to the lead, external lead. She had Monel metal centerboard trunk, smash step, and some transverse frames and things, which were all. But these, because Paper Tiger's rating was so low, they all got hyped about that, and they had her re-rated, and the rating went down by 0.2 or something.
Was that a bronze board?
Paper Tiger?
Yeah.
No, it was sheet metal, steel.
Huh.
But we tried some early epoxies that never would harden. Yes. And it was a foil section, but it was just cleaned up, puttied up to make it, had to kind of to hammer it into shape.
But
to
what
get-
was draft with that board down?
Oh, maybe 9 feet. So she was about, well, she would have been 4 feet basic draft. She went down about 3 inches because everything that got loaded onto her, the owner didn't give a damn about trying to stick to what we had designed her at. But, and he was not a racing skipper. He just put some guys together that somehow we did well because we had enough stability in high winds, and she had to power through those big old seas in the Gulf Stream and all, or we went downwind pretty fast because we could be driven hard, keep the chute up. And on the second year, we wish we had a downwind. We won the Miami-Nassau race twice with her.
Well,
Anyway.
I think I should bow out here.
Okay, well, anytime you want to ask questions like that of me, you know, we can get together.
Okay, all right.
I'm just burning off golden years here.
Okay, I'm certainly enjoying it, Charlie. For those of you guys who are on here, I have a little personal connection with Charlie that he wasn't aware of till I reminded him recently, but the year the Valiant 40 was introduced at the Annapolis show, I was sitting in the cockpit watching the people get on and off the boat, and all of a sudden I look up and damn, there's Charley Morgan. And he went below, and I was sort of nervous and watched. Then he came out, and I didn't say anything. I was kind of tongue-tied, and he looked over at me and he said, "God bless you, Bob." And then he walked away.
She was a precious boat. She was, and I don't know who all is on and listening at this point in time, but I'm going to evangelize Bob here from the bottom of my heart for his conduct and his career, not as a designer, but his career as a commentator and a writer. He initiated a great stream of educating many people who were not initiated to the technicalities of boat design or just the general seamanship requirements of a good yacht, a good cruising boat, or a good cruiser racer, whatever it might have been. And through his stories in the various periodicals he wrote or got out, he brought so many people up to a much higher level of understanding of generally accepted ideas about offshore cruising yachts, coastal cruisers, shallow draft cruisers, you know, around the world adventurers and all that sort of thing, during a time when a great transition was made from wooden construction to the early days of this gooey stuff we call funny glass, and now to the very high-tech things that he's doing in the carbon fiber, Kevlar, whatever reinforcements are being used in the boats he's designing today, all of which led to a great body of information. And one of the things that always struck me is so many of the pundits, and I don't include him as a pundit, he was an authority on the generally accepted concepts, ideas, and factual engineering associated with naval architecture of sailing yachts, our favorite sport. And God bless you for that too, young man.
Thank you, Charlie.
I mean, it really made a difference.
Oh,
And it made people understand a lot about what we were dealing with. And I don't think I ever heard of or saw a sharp-tongued report on anybody's boat that was not coming out of the mouth of Bob or his pen. But he would tell it like he saw it together with the body of knowledge that was accumulating as we went along for generally accepted good design and construction practices. So here's to you, young man. You did a good on you, as the Aussies would say.
yeah, thanks, Charlie.
And
All
He's
done it regularly for years.
That's a great introduction. So we have a bunch of guys on. Good morning, everybody. I think we got 11 to 12 on, and that's not a, not an unmanageable amount of people. So if you guys want to, you guys can unmute, and if we go in alphabetical order, starting my video, I got Mark Blackburn. If you have a question, you could start us off, Mark, and then you guys just jump in, and we'll just go as we need. The list of questions that I got from everybody, I don't see anyone on that submitted the actual question yet. So.
I'm here.
Hey, good morning, Charlie.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
Excellent. I'm near the San Francisco Bay Area, and had a question for you. Me and a number of my buddies used to follow the America's Cup very closely. We well remember your campaign, and it was a significant one, if I remember correctly. You also were helmsman and designer, and probably wore half the hats in the whole campaign. I'm wondering if you could just take a few minutes and give us your own debrief now, many years later.
Well, the state of the designs at the time of 1970 were season after season, America's Cup season after season, had been progressively moving toward heavier boats, which simply meant they couldn't build the wood any lighter, and were using a longer waterline and reduced sail area. With the refinement of hulls kept improving over years. They seemed to hit a wall until the time of Intrepid, which came out, as we all know, was sort of a super yacht. And the different folks coming along were sticking pretty much to increase the water line a quarter of a foot, but it was progressively getting out there until it went from around 45 feet on the water line to up about 48 feet. But it was very delicious to think of how much power and capability to carry a full-size Jenny and full main in a 25 knot breeze of wind, which we often experience in the actual finals. And I think we all got Valiant came out heavier than designed heavier. She was right on her buttons as far as the design work was concerned. But she was 72,000 pounds to yeah. I was about 70,000 pounds. Really, Chance Modified Intrepid was about 68,000 pounds. Now, if you go back to 58, when the 12-meter rule was adopted for the America's Cup, Columbia was 58,000 pounds. Now, I don't know what the lead was on Intrepid. I don't know what, I didn't have Intrepid lines. I didn't have any lines other than some of the very early 12s that were published by Ophir Fox. But nevertheless, these boats were getting heavier. But the ballast on these late boats for 70 was so much more than it had been on Columbia. Columbia's total weight was 58,000 pounds, and her keel was, the top of her deadwood was slanted. The top of the lead in Heritage was horizontal, and we stood on the top of the lead. We had sort of a wishbone keel arrangement, and she was bolted on with the famous old airsoft method of tapping into the lead and diagonally bolting. And so this will surprise you to know that the keel on Heritage was roughly around 50,000 pounds itself. And her total weight was 72. We know that we weighed every part that went into her. We weighed her hull, her she was built with Sitka spruce laminated ribs and the same construction method that Bill Luder's used for American Eagle. I did that because I wanted to use the boat for ocean racing later on. It was
That's almost 70% ballast displacement ratio.
right. And
Unheard of.
Yes.
well, that was very, I have no idea what it was, but had to be somewhere in the same range on Valiant. And, but what really went on there was you couldn't build a wooden hull much lighter than 10,000 pounds. And I talked to Bob Director about it, and Bob is dead and gone. So I hate to say this, but I was having coffee with him. He says, "Hey, Morgan, how light was that hull with no hardware on it?" And I said, "I'm going to tell you that unless you tell me something." And so I said, "Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll write my bare hull weight on a paper napkin here. You write yours for Valiant on your paper napkin. When we get up to go back to the shops, I was going to watch the launching of it and of Valiant, and sure enough, he winked at me like I guess he acknowledged that we were roughly the same weight. It couldn't be much different because Lloyd's of London was the insurers were looking on the scantlings, and we couldn't. But what we did do was a lot of unique things that gave us a little bit more lower center of gravity of the wooden part. And I showed that to Owen when he at Newport. I invited him aboard. He said, "Can you do that?" And he said, "Well, is that okay with your syndicate?" And I said, "I don't have a syndicate, so you can come see my boat." And so we went over just before the Bermuda race that year and took a look at her. But yeah, we all made the same mistake. There were certain discrepancies in the test tank work, because we were getting outside of the appropriate range for the dash pots on the dynamometer to the model weight was getting outside the range for little 60-inch models. And we needed the scale effects when all that were getting in there. We got a note from Pete Desay, who was running the lab at the time at Stevens, and said, well, they had recalibrated the dynamometer and had come up with an error for the upright resistance in many of the speed ranges tested. They might be as much as 1 to 2% off. Oh my God! Everybody went back to clean up things during the season of the trials, the early trials. Reballasted the boats in some cases. I think we modified ours to some degree, but we were at the extremes of the envelope. And the 3 months after our last engagement in the trials, they adopted aluminum as a construction medium for 12 meters under the Lloyd's approved scantlings. Well, the first aluminum boats came out roughly the weight of Columbia of 1958. So we all had been sticking to wood. I think Heritage, I'm pretty sure Heritage was the last American 12 constructed. Incidentally, by the way, her number was 23, but it was really 24. And Harry Anderson of the New York Yacht Club begged me to give 24 to the New York Yacht Club entry Valiant, because Bob, the Commodore Club at the time, didn't want to go out to the list with a number lower than the latest American 12. But we accommodated and switched numbers, and the numbers were issued by Lloyd's. But in any case,
So VCG on those boats,
sir.
the VCG on those 12s, how far below the waterline was it?
Well, that was pretty far down. I can't tell you the number now. I've given all those things to the museum, but
That'd be 4 or 5 feet.
well, it was definitely down there. These things we sucked. With the lead, the top of the lead was horizontal. You could stand on it. It was 5 feet across on the flange part of it, And we sucked from work we did on studying Paper Tiger, we knew that we had to bring the weights out of the ends, bring all the centroids in so that moments of inertia were reduced, and that the polar moments, and that we did the same on the 12s and brought it all in and compacted in close to the centers of motion, locus of points that were in all the degrees of motion that you would have in a rough sea, which meant that the whole dynamics of sailing was improved. We knew that from ocean racing, and everybody was doing it for the 12 meters, trying to make it all the ends light, everything down to the minimus. And one thing that was I did not have ribbon rigging. I just could not bring myself to go down to the reduction of safety factors. Bob, this was very curious. I asked Olin one time, we were sharing stateroom on the New York Yacht Club cruise, what the safety factors they were going to on the 12s. And he said, Charlie, I don't think I should answer that to you, but they were lower than standards. And they went down to as low as 1.2, Bob.
Wow.
And the reason they did that, I finally learned from Bob Blumenstock or somebody who was measurer at the time, that they did that because the New York Yacht Club would refuse to start an America's Cup race in anything above 12 knots of wind velocity. So that, and that just, I couldn't stomach. So I operated much more closely in the realms of what we would use for an offshore cruising boat. Funny thing, when I checked out the ribbon rigging, I couldn't keep within the safety factors and use ribbon rigging. My choice of safety factors. So, but we had titanium ends on a very high strength Latrobe steel rods. It was 285,000 PSI tensile strength.
It was round rod.
Round rods. And it was before Teddy Hood came up with the squash rods, which are a little bit lower drag. But they came in one day with the titanium terminals that were going to be used. And I put them in my hand and I looked at them and I said, those things, I just can't handle that. Titanium was so light and they were so, but they were, I think that because they were titanium, I was working with about a 3.5 to 1 or 4 to 1 safety, 4 to 1 safety factor for these highly stressed components. Why did I do that? When I was sailing on Columbia, every day I would go up one side or the other side of the rigging and check them, and found that just by the increase in a little lead that we stripped out, added to Columbia at 62, we found that the high strength steel components of the rod rigging and attachments onto the spar were being egg-shaped, and we had to change them out. So I knew that. That's why I even asked what was the safety factor they were working on, because I just couldn't stomach it. And sure enough, in one of the races, we were on top of Nefertiti, and we blew the rig out of Columbia in about a 22 knot Smoky Southwester, and off Point Judith, and that set us back quite a bit with our campaign that year.
The rod, the fitting broke or the rod broke?
Well, actually what broke was we were examining the rig that night. Olin and I went out, we went to dinner. He took me to dinner. He said, Charlie, could you join me at Christie's for lobster tonight? I said, well, yeah. And I was afraid that we were the some of the younger guys like myself on the boat that year were bending the mast, and Rod was against all of that. He wanted a straight spar, no monkeying around with all of that. And of course, he knew something I didn't know at the time, was that they were using very low safety factors. Well, so I thought, well, they're fixing to throw me off the boat because I was into the bending the rig and doing starboat things and traveler controls, which we had much quicker controls on all those kind of things. But this was the transitional stage. And by the way, it was still the stage before we had the foil leading edges, and we were still using snaps. Put the Genoa jibs before the start into stops, rubber stops, and it was still archaic. This many years ago now, 50 years, 51 years, 50 years ago, I guess. Anyhow, we were bending the rig, not anything like they eventually did. And we're looking things over, trying to figure out what failed. And we had run into this. The pins that hold the rod rigging together, Bob, were high strength aircraft engine hanger bolts that not Boeing, but Grumman had made up for us. Bobby Hall out there was chief of engineering and testing. We joggled those because of a cluster at the end of the spreaders. And I remember one night we had to take the joggled pin out by using dry ice packed around this to shrink it so we could get this joggled pin out. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to sail the next day. So, we were working on the very edge of sensibility in my mind, not to criticize them, but they knew just how far they could go. I didn't know those things. And so I always worried about it. But Olin and I, after dinner, we went out to look at the wreckage. And what had failed was the aluminum spar where the spreader butts came in on a single shear pin, of all things, pressed in the backside of the spreader. As the spar bent, it loaded up the back edge and it dimpled the mast. And from there, things began to fail once it had yielded. And so I said, oh my gosh, Olin, take a look at this, And he said, And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I was urging the spars be built a bit more. And he said, Charlie, we were going faster. We just need to design the fixtures to take it. And that they didn't throw me off. But, I had built a sail and I needed it to be done to do what I wanted to do with the sail. Amazing. But anyhow, we all went way too far on one edge of the envelope. And as I say, once they built an aluminum boat, or then later fiberglass boats, they were all back down to lightweight. And for those that may not know it, the lightest 12 meter that I know of was the Australia 2. She had a 23 something waterline, I believe, and was a quick boat, but she did not have the horsepower for reaching. And nevertheless, if you have a moderate to light breeze, which in the trials, the old records that Mike Vanderbilt got together for the America's Cup pre-war, I heard information to this effect, was that the average wind velocity was 8 knots during the trials. So only in the actual America's Cup races did we, occasionally we would see a smoky sou'wester blow in and break a sail or two. Maybe somebody would lose a mast, but that was a rarity. So we were dealing with really smooth water a good bit of the time. And I think we all got a little bit enamored with the idea of how much R sub h cosine theta, which is measure of the stability and in the test tank. And we saw lots of it because of building very light hulls and lots of lead and a little bit longer water. And I don't believe that the small scale models, later years, they were testing much larger models. I think everybody understands that, because it got rid of part of the scale effect. And I found that out in '63, testing in the wind tunnel. We were there trying to wait for the turbulence in the tank to settle down one afternoon after lunch. And in walks a fellow I'd never met at the tank before. And he walks in, I looked up at him and he says, "Hello, I'm Earl Uram. God bless you, Earl, wherever you are." And he said, "What are you guys up to?" I said, "We're just waiting for the turbulence to settle down so we can make one more run before I have to catch an airplane. And I sure wish we had a way of testing these things in the wind tunnel like the aircraft guys." He said, "Oh, we've got a little wind tunnel next door." And I said, "Really?" So we went in there. And Bob, I'll send you a picture of the wind tunnel test we did in '63. And what we did was we plastered onto the made equivalent of a boat tail effect, which we added to Columbia in a later year. And we used clay and a little electric plate we had there for heating coffee in a 2-gallon or 2-quart aluminum coffee pot. It was in the laboratory there, so while we were waiting, we could have coffee. And so we threw a pan of water on there, and somebody had left a butter knife, of all things, right there. So we smeared the softened clay, modeling clay, onto the hull. And later they pushed little tubes, little bronze tube or copper tubes, tiny little tubes attached to manometers to on a piece of plywood, so we could measure the pressure differences in the area of the quarter wave. Everybody was trying to kill the quarter wave, Bob. And so it was tested, and you could see that this equalized or straightened out a lot of the separated flow in the tail end of a boat. We also stuck a hot wire or thermistor through.
When you say equalizer, what are you talking about?
Well, the hydraulic jump, the quarter wave, the vorticity, what we found was the vorticity was started way forward. And once it was started, you had a quarter wave, and you always got it. But it was subdued in later versions of 12 meters. And we learned that the way forward, where the keel proper began to depart from the canoe body, you might say, that there was vorticity being introduced there because of different velocities over the surface and the lifting part of the keel, the weather side, and on the weather side of the hull, but there were different velocities up to a point. I mean, well, they were up to some point, the velocities radically departed because the suction on the keel was greater than the suction on the hull because it was a better lifting body. So that introduced vorticity. So the hot wire was showing us the region where this was happening. We could measure and the instrumentation was set up so it could tell these temperature differences in the velocity, and you could stick the wire in and out into the cage, I mean, to the little 8-foot tunnel. But anyhow, this is all new stuff that we were grasping for. But I can send you that photograph, which was fun to do, and it had Earl Uram was a scientist. He was just assigned to drift around the laboratories, the different ones that were going on in the school there, and give hands wherever he could. And he said, "No, you won't get anything exact, but you will get qualitative ideas about what's happening." And so I won't say the bustle came from that because this was a heavy displacement boat, and some of the one-tonners and all that had the so-called bustles. But the evolution into what became the Intrepid style of hull, suddenly we realized you could redistribute the displacement, not violate the precious things that we all thought about prismatic coefficients, but you could clean up the scatter that was coming from the testing in the test tanks as they improved the testing facility and all of that. And the big scale boats, you could see it. But it was always part of this long path of trying to refine within the framework of that rule, the hull forms. So it was just one of the steps along the way. And
Well, when you started the tank testing, how many models did you have?
I started in '63 testing a generic hull, which had more wetted surface and was 45 feet on the waterline, as I think, back. And it was to be a benchmark for succeeding models. And we ran quite a few. I can't tell you how many now, over a period of years before I got into the point where I could afford to buy one myself or make one, but a 12. However, the tank procedures were improving along the way, and our benchmarks were moving. And so your database, the thing that Olin had was his structural weight analysis, and he stuck to one thing and knew exactly what would be happening. And he had a body of work that began back with Lee Loomis's, what do you call that boat?
Starling Burgess.
Well, Lee Loomis had a boat that
Ranger.
well, Ranger was a J, but Lee Loomis had when he graduated from Harvard, he got a boat. His father gave him a boat that Olin designed called. She's still sailing and racing up there from time to time.
Gorade?
Say again?
Gorade?
No, this was a 12.
Oh,
Northern Light. Northern Light is a 12. It's out there still. She's number 14, I think. 14, 15, maybe was Vim. 16 was Columbia. 17 was Weatherly. Nefertiti came out. So that was about it. So Northern Light. So anyhow, they had such a good database, and I really struggled with the idea of whether I should wait another season. I tried to buy Columbia. They wouldn't sell it to me. I thought, well, I could get my teeth cut on that. But for some reason, they just wouldn't take my check for it. But anyway, there was a big sweeping changes. And once we, my boat was certainly quite light hull, and she was Alaskan Sitka spruce for the laminated ribs, and American white oak, or white ash rather, for her bent frames. Using the style that was developed for American Eagle by Bill Deuters, and I really liked that strong structural system. And she was double planked. The inner strakes were the Western red cedar. The exterior top sides were Sitka spruce, and the bottom planking was actually Western red cedar. We used a lot of the internals of Western red cedar. Her decks had no crown, and that was so we could take a battery powered tool and drill a hole, and while we were sailing, and unbuckle it for the next go around and So the same afternoon of sailing, we could shift a winch, move cleats and blocks and leads and all that sort of thing. But we almost lost the boat when we launched her. The insurance company wanted a toggle bar and 2 cranes, a matched pair of cranes, and they left the counterweight off of one on a 1,200 or a 2,200 pound.
Yeah, I remember. That was a disaster.
That was almost killed my family and the priest. God.
Your 12 had a much beefier stern sections.
Well, I'd say that was a mistake. And the reason I say it's a mistake, because Olin and I would be sailing right next to Nefertiti on top of her. I remember one day it was off Point Judith, it was blowing like hell. And every time a puff would hit, Nefertiti's quarter wave would jump up big time. And he'd say, look at the energy in that thing. And so we were sitting there one day waiting for the wind and a little bit of a seaway, not much, but you would see Nefertiti bounce to the wave and you would see, and I jokingly said, that's an acre of wetted surface that's being added every time that sea goes up under her. And I got to know Britton Chance pretty well over the years. And I noticed that he cut away call it the hip if you want to, back in the quarter, and narrowed down the sections, and there were the rule girths and all of those things got into the picture of it. And that was an actual mistake that hurt her in lighter going. But we just were behind the power curve and couldn't make it up. And the last race I sailed against Intrepid, we got to start, sailed a little bit away from her, never felt I could cross her bow by tacking from starboard to port. And then the tugboat got hidden behind a rain squall, and so we both went way beyond the way line. We were just using hand calculations in those days. We did not have electronics to do navigation with. So that was, we tacked, she laid the line she was on my quarter. We both tacked and she laid out beneath me, got over beat me around and marked a couple of seconds. And they sprung the so-called star cut jib, which we didn't know about and had been ruled off when I was trying to do one of those in '62 when I was sailing on Columbia, and they would not allow it. Cornish Shields was very anxious to do it, and we got the ruling that it's not going to be an appropriate rendering of the rules about the luff lengths and so on. But anyway, it was a great experience. And once they put that star cut up, they ripped a minute a mile off of me. And that really worked. And of course, all ocean racers had it after that.
It was a star cut Genoa.
Yeah. Well, it tacked down at the bow on the spinnaker pole.
Oh, okay.
So it was 180% reaching jib.
Yeah.
Because the girth was controlled then by the spinnaker, it being a spinnaker, a so-called light sail. You got that? That's
It rated as a jib.
And it just was very functionally better, and it was of a lighter, not a lighter, but a slightly heavier fabric that held its shape and form. And boy, you could adjust the halyard and let it flow away and open the slot behind the mainsail, and the mainsail was working half again hard. It was a beautiful idea. Here's to Ted about it, or whoever talked him into it. Ted Hood, God bless him. He was one of the great thinkers of my time. But yeah, there was just so many things going on, and the Intrepid, I believe, and Nolan did too, that the Intrepid, as she came out with maybe one or two improvements they could have made would have been faster boat than any of us, including the new Valiant. Valiant never seemed to get it together. I don't know why. I guess Owen knew that the underbodies were being cut away on Intrepid, the old Intrepid, quite a bit. And he was testing to see how far down, but we just needed larger models to appropriately take care of that. But Bob, remind me to send you that wind tunnel picture.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah, and we can have a conversation anytime you feel like getting together. I'm just spending off my days here. Go ahead. Anybody got a question? Thank you. It's a smart question. Yeah. Any other? I hope I helped a little bit there with what you were looking for.
Sure, I'll go if people aren't jumping in. Oh, Mark, you jumping in?
Let me just thank Charlie. That was absolutely great to hear that description. Thank you so much.
Well, I hate to be like a butterfly in a patch of phlox bouncing around all those things, but
No, that was all great. Thank you.
sure. Okay.
Okay, I'll jump in. Thank you. This is one of those things where you're sitting in like a bar or a restaurant or somewhere and you hear two people talking in the background with a certain familiarity, and you catch in on the conversation and you hear names coming up like Teddy or Olin or Britt, and you realize that you're amongst someone who has the entire history of a unique opportunity, an event that happened in time that you're interested in, and the hair stands up on the back of your head, which it's doing, because you don't get this opportunity or this exposure. And I can't thank you enough, and I can't thank Bob enough for giving us the access to this. Especially, I've spent a little bit of time sailing on some of the 12s, and just to hear the evolution of the wood to fiberglass and the testing that went into it, and especially before there was a lot of computational availability, and you're sitting at SI at the tank, and then going to the wind tunnel and hearing, that Grumman's making the bolts, and you guys are talking about how hard to bend the mast, with the understanding that a lot of these boats are designed that, well, if we don't break them every once in a while, we're not going to know how far to push them.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. Again, this is just one of those rare opportunities when you're in the.
Bob will tell you though that Bob's a genuine thing. There are a lot of guys that
Hear that, Jill?
but his boats were meant to go offshore, and anybody that designs anything that's going to go offshore, far from safe refuge,
Right.
Put quotation marks around far from safe refuge, and then picture yourself out there with something gone wrong, somebody injured on your damn boat, and you're going to be at best wait for the storm to go down and get your freight back to safety or medical care, or just get out of it. So these things keep guys like Bob and any appropriately ethically postured designer. You're not going to go freaking around with too many things that are, on the edge, because you just can't do it. And I don't think anybody would ever fault anything that Bob got out that I know of. And we back in the days. See, my history goes back from 1946 roughly to when I began to hear those voices in the background. I was a kid working for a sailmaker in the summers and sailing on cruising boats overnight races around the coast here, going to Cuba while I was still in high school and so on. But the names I would see would be Olin Stevens, Kayagi Nielsen, Phil Rhodes, John Alden. I remember John having some kind of a fainting spell at the dinner party before one of the Cuba races. I sailed on a number of Alden boats, and Halsey Hairsoff and I became friends a long time back. And he's a great engineer, designer, physicist. But those names, and then the younger guys that were getting into the mix later on would be a Bob Director type, and some of the builders and that were really excellent, Bill Looters, and I was in the Mallory Cup, first Mallory Cup series after the war, and that's where I met Corny Shields, and later sailed on Columbia. The Shields family sponsored that campaign, and I don't know how I fell into that crevice of time and the names and so on, but Al Mason with Bill Tripp. Bill was a little older than I. Al Mason was somewhat older, one of the finest of the pack. And K. Augie Nielsen, I remember up in Paden there, I'm sitting on a ledge there talking to that great man and one of the most gifted designers and detail draftsmen and so on. It's just so, I feel so honored to have been part of that little flotsam and jetsam flowing along with all of those things that were happening. And then the next thing I know, here I was this thing that we experienced, depending on what time slot you were in, the huge burgeoning growth of organized sailing and boating, both for cruisers and racers, small boats and everything. We could travel, we could, like at one point I had a matched pair of Italian stars, one on this coast and one on the other coast, or one abroad. There's, just so I could jump on a plane and go sail with my buddies out west or whatever. What a world. But these were things that was happening, and the wonderful thing about our sport and our way of life, we're a cluster of people who sailing and both the competitive and cruising side, just the enjoyment of sailing, altered our psyche, our enjoyment of life, and the way we raised our children. All kinds of things got into that picture. It's a beautiful thing. And then you had a writer here in town who illuminated a lot of what was going on in the Southern Circuit. I think I was telling Joe, God bless you, Joe, too, for helping put all this sort of thing together. But the first race after the Great War, Great Patriotic War, I call it, instead of a political war, maybe all political. But we had, I think, 15 boats in the Cuba race. The next year it was about 17. Maybe the next year was about 20. I think the first year I went down, it was 23 boats. And there came a time that we had 96 boats, I think, in the Fort Lauderdale to Miami, to St. Pete to Miami, or Fort Lauderdale race. And I was co-chair of the Southern Ocean Racing Circuit. And I got out of it because I was in the business. I didn't like being in any official capacity, helping run a race or organize. And if I did everything I could to make it happen, but so we got St. Pete Yacht Club was a great club for inaugurating the Southern Circuit's start, and we had great clubs on the other side. So we had some wonderful, wonderful ocean racing. And anyway, I feel so.
The second part, I'm sorry, you still going? I apologize.
Say again?
I was going to say the second part is, having spent a lot of times on sailboats, I have never had more fun than on your Out Island, a pre-86 Out Island 41. I went to school in Miami, so I overlapped a lot on the SORC.
Did you?
But a girl in our group, dad's had a boat in charter, a 41 in charter in St. Pete. So we would dry over on the weekends if it wasn't out on charter. And without a doubt, the Out Island 41 was the boat I had most fun on.
The boats were criticized by a lot of the racing fraternity, but
Who cares?
not going to windward. On the other hand, the dealership organization wanted to have simpler boats without centerboards. a great part of the eastern seaboard of the United States is shoal water, and the Bahamas are shoal water. And I took keel boats with a 5-6 foot draft back and forth often when I would race. And you didn't want that. And you couldn't really feel comfortable cruising if you were uninitiated over in these strange waters and those strange waters. And the economic determinants of what would sell and get people out on the water. One of the things that Joe and I were talking about, I should bring up, one of the key things that made the so-called production boats viable was consumer credit. So you could actually have, say, an Out Island 41 or one of the less expensive boats like that, that you could, if you were an airline pilot, I was using an example, you were going to be, knew you were going to be retired at 65. You knew you were, if you went in for, I think they had 5-year programs, a tax code at the time fitted into it. And so you could put that thing in service, and by the time you got your retirement notice, you could step aboard that baby and go cruising, and you'd already been using it off and on and got into the cruising wave. And that helped finance the so-called cruising fleets. And the industry suffered a great deal when the tax code revised that, and without the merits of whether it was a good idea or not, the companies that were building boats abroad were subsidized by their governments to keep the jobs for the people in these countries like Finland or France or wherever that were entering into the charter business. But the consumer credit made it possible to have a boat that you, in the early days of the condominium boom in Florida, you could have a condominium for about what it costs for Out Island 41, somewhere in the neighborhood. By the time you, so our auditors were Ernst and Ernst, and we would be able to show them ways to package the make-ready costs, that put it into operation, and so on. So those were sheltering some of the income, the high income that, say, aviation pilots or somebody with a good job. And so you could have a boat that you could leave in Florida. You could come down in the winter. You could go cruising in the winter. Your kids could come down over the holidays instead of going up to the beaches and getting drunk and crazy. Or they could come down and live on the boat and do a little sailing around the Keys or whatever, to Tampa Bay and all along our coast, which is very beautiful. And those determinants helped a lot in making it possible for and again, it's a rare thing that people will even comprehend the fact that we could build, and were building for a period of the better part of a year, one a day, Out Island 41s, using modern management controls and methods to actually do that, which was, we should have been raising the price, but I was having fun with the sandbox, my partner and me, and just doing it and making it happen.
How many did you build?
Well, I retired in, I think, the summer of 72 or 73. By that time, I think, or the last time I knew anything, I think about 1,100 or more of them. And Catalina got more out. They modified the hull into a more fin hull boat. We had various modifications of the interiors, and they had a lot of wooden structures, and we had rather, and they later put a fin keel on. They had to shift the mast around on it because they got hard-headed. The last sailing that I did before I wound up with 2 kinds of cancer at the same time. One of them was a Merkel cell. Nobody ever heard of that till I found one on my head. So I quit sailing, but I did sail occasionally on a Morgan 38.
A Ted Brewer boat.
Yeah. Well, no, I sailed against a Ted Brewer boat. I'm mixing apples and oranges here. The Out Island 41s against the old, the the new out on the 41s, they were about equal as near as we could tell in the racing that they did around here.
Well, what was the sail away price on the 41 when it was new?
I believe it was 39,500, something like that. And that, well, that was the, wait a minute, that was the factory billing. No, that was the suggested retail price. And there was we operated on very low margins with dealers. And that was true of the sailboat industry. But later, my friend Dick Gantz, who long gone now, who went down to take over Chris Craft Industries years later, I went down to help him spin that company up from around 26 million to about just under 200 million a year. And I found out that they had markups that were in the neighborhood of 36 to 38%, which I had never heard of in the sailing boat industry. But that was, again, the way things were then. There was a lot of economics in it. But we did introduce short interval scheduling, just in time kits where the vendors furnished the cleat with all of its fasteners and everything together. And we had PERT, critical path analysis of the procedures. And we eventually introduced a 40-hour, 4-day work week, which many of our people came out of the building trades and were middle-aged people, and they really did enjoy having a long weekend or a holiday weekend where you could feel like you had a full week off. And later, after we had merged the company into Beatrice Foods, they abandoned that method, but it was a good thing for working in but we cycled the most once a day, and it was a highly integrated thing, and it actually got us the opportunity to do the Disney World project over here at Disney World, which the Admiral Fowler saw we didn't have computers, by the way, so we were turning old drawings over and plastering on the sail off walls and doing our bubble charts and control refinements on those charts. Later, we did get an accounting computer system. Okay, just shoot it. Anybody's got something we want to talk about. We've got a bandmaster there. Joe's pretty good at that. So,
Fairly
up,
good.
Joe.
Whoever wants to ask a question, go for it.
Hi, I'd like to jump in, please.
Go ahead.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name's Eric. I sail on Tampa Bay. Mr. Morgan,
Hey there.
I have one of your 24s.
No kidding.
Yes, I do. And for a decade, I sailed on one of your 38s. And we were a cocky bunch. We would say, you name a race, I'll show you a trophy. And it was that way. We had sail number 3825, and we were, in my opinion anyway, untouchable. And it was your boat. It was well prepared, well crewed, but it was just an inherently fast boat. And I thank you for that. We had many years and a lot of beers and a lot of good times. So thank you so much for that.
Well, that little 24 was actually a startling little boat design, and it was. I knew Bob Director pretty well, and he had a little 35 or 6 footer that he brought down here for the Southern Circuit one year, and it was a good boat all around. And there was another boat designed, I guess it was a Hairsoft design, Buzzards Bay, a little small 36 footer at Buzzards Bay. One day we were waiting for the wind to settle down up in Buzzards Bay in the 62 New York Yacht Club cruise, and he pointed out a boat. And he said, "Oh, that's the Bristol or Herself Buzzards Bay 36, I think he called it." Doesn't make it. And I watched that boat. She was bouncing around on her hook, waiting for racing to get organized that particular day. And we talked about it. He says, that boat has been a good boat under a number of rating systems. And it was just a discussion we had, but I never forgot it. And Bob Director brought his little boat about that size down here, and it was a fast boat.
What was
Anyhow,
it called? What was the name of that boat? Do you remember?
it was Gray Goose.
Oh, okay.
Gray Goose. It had a centerboard, and it just operated in the Gulf shop pretty damn well. But the little 24, one owner took one 3,800 nautical mile cruise by himself on one of those little boats. And I told him, you don't take that boat offshore without setting up your storm sails and your methodologies for taking care of bad weather and sea keeping on your own. And God bless him. He was a great navigator, and he took that little boat 2 times on that whole run, and later got a different boat with his third wife, I guess, and went down into the islands. She was a tartan, something or other, with a deeper keel, so that it was a bigger boat so he could take his wife with him. But anyway, they were fun boats, and we came out with that boat. We called it the Ugly Duckling in the first part of it, and we were just trying to develop Morgan at the time, and we built the plug for it and took the molds off, and then hung the plug up on the rafters of one of the buildings, and waited, because we weren't sure where mind you, we had bootstrapped that company up from the ground, and in those days you just you couldn't get financing from a bank or anything. I don't know how the hell we ever did it, to tell you the truth, but we had a couple of 3 custom yachts that helped us get going. Built a 60-footer for one man. He said he wanted to have a Class A state-of-the-art boat, and we got him something out that was a very good boat, a lovely boat, been around the world twice, still around somewhere in New Jersey, set up in a barn or a warehouse. But she was a fine boat, but the tide was changing under the CCA rule. We had won the race. Charley, a young designer, a little older than me at the time, now gone. Well, he was a buddy from mothboat racing days, and we had won the Chicago Mackinac race with a 32-foot plywood boat called Feather 2, and startled them all with that thing. And it was a very fast boat with a big rig and a wide beam, and hence Ted Hood style of boat, big beam, keel centerboard, Finisterre with a small rig, good sized beam, a lot of stability, and they go like hell in a blow. But the light boat with a big beam and a big rig tortured them in the Chicago Mackinac race, and they just couldn't believe what happened. But the little 24 was designed around the CCA, not the CCA, but the MORC ocean racing rule. And it was designed for that group. And Tampa Bay was, once we had the scorekeeping method for the SORC evolved, where we could have run 2 series, one that started here and one that started on the other coast, throw out your bad races and pick the ones for the high point races. And the Miami-Nassau equal the Fort Lauderdale race. And so all the little feeder races counted for participation. And that made it work. And that's what made it bloom. The competition was fun, and we had good race management on both sides of the state, and the cooperation over in the Bahamas was great. And so it worked out. The little 24 was and Teddy Hood, should mention my pal Teddy, who died a few years back now from lymphoma. Ted got in after me, and the largest production yachts we built were 54 feet. Ted got in and began to have boats that would be up to 65, modified some later, but the market would take it. And those were very nice, but had a lot of accommodation in them, and they were reasonably priced, and people seemed to, I don't know where the money came from the whole time, but it was there, and people were going around the world. Out on, would you believe, out on 41s have been around the world, at least two of them I know of. One way is the hard way, left San Francisco and went around and came back. I guess I went down to see that guy. He and his wife were both nurses, and they had a cat that made it all the way with them. And I went down to my wife, who was liked to be in the yacht brokerage business at the time. I was retired, and she went out to talk to him. I said, well, I'm coming down there. I want to talk to people who went around the world in that boat. But they survived very well. People often would call me and ask me what the critical angle of heel on it was. And I said, well, the best I can tell you is we were anchored in the Bahamas in Salt Creek, or Salt Key, or whatever, way south of Georgetown, for the Family Island Regatta that they had down there. And a big steel hooker was anchored to catch, and a storm came in. I was on a sport fishing as a floating home for the regatta, and an out island 41 came in and dropped hook and waited for the storm, and they both took the first blast of the storm, and the out island 41, the wind shifted right at the end, and she swung around on her anchor and knocked down to about what you would call a rail down angle, and the other boat later spread her down in the water. And I thought, well, the reserve stability is there. That's enough. But every one of them
knocked it down with bare poles.
Yeah, boy, it was a vicious squall, and the out island relieved herself. She just spun around with the wind, knocked down about 35, 40 degrees, and spun around and then stood up once she was head to wind. And I thought that was a pretty good test. But the reserve stability with the type of raised deck and closed deck that was not flooding gave a great deal of additional stability. One of the things that designers have to keep in mind, though, is what is the outfit that gets put into a boat, and what does it do to elevate the center of gravity afterwards? You do all your design work and you try to outthink your people, but they load them up, and they load them up, and they load them up. And if it isn't a water maker, it's an air conditioner or both, or a bigger generator. Or they swap out a small auxiliary engine and put in a bigger engine. So these things are bugaboos for builders and designers, but it affects all of the seakeeping. And one thing I certainly want to say to all of you is, anytime you're planning to go offshore, you're planning to go into a completely different, far from safe refuge. I throw that out there. A day or two of hard weather is not such a bad thing, maybe. But if you're not prepared, if you have not tried your storm gear out, know how it works, put on a separate track for your storm trysail, or know how to make the boat do its thing in bad weather, lie to, and when you get confused seas, they act differently than they do in a normal seaway. And be prudent and think ahead of what you're going to do if somebody's injured. We lost a Morgan 41 aft cockpit boat, a guy and his buddy who did not know how to sail, and two girls that just wanted to go to Bermuda in November, sometime in November. And they went offshore and got caught in a small equivalent of a hurricane. A seagoing tug was lost that night, just disappeared. And this boat they started running off before it and didn't know how to slow her down under bare poles. And she broached on the crest of a big sea and cracked her side over a bulkhead. Began to take on some water. And they came upon a tanker, and the tanker laid to for them, and they got up alongside. The engine running, it was night, became night, and the engine running, the spreader lights were still working, and they one by one climbed off the boat and got off and abandoned her. Never heard of her again. And the thing that the man came and ordered a 54-footer from us because he wanted to do a single-headed race from Europe over to America. And ordered the boat. We again sit with our engineering group and talk about actually what happened and explained it to us. And they became exhausted in this storm. They did not have any preparation for storm gear. They just decided to take off. And they became exhausted and just abandoned her to run off before it. And didn't even know to put up a Spitfire jib and strap it down in the middle of the boat just to hold her head down and prevent broaching. They didn't know anything about putting out any kind of lines or drags to keep the stern to. And she made good weather of it, but finally they got her sideways and she fell off the crest of the sea and cracked her sides. And anyway, the takeaway from all of that to me is you really need to be preparing yourself before you go offshore in offshore conditions and learn what to do with your boat and have, when somebody's injured, or if you get seasick, if you get disoriented, you get fatigued, all those things get into the picture. So you guys sound like, well, I admire your club work here, Joe, and all of you that fantasize about this world that Bob lives in. But it's a great world, and he's a dedicated proponent of it, and he is, I certainly have admired his efforts and his professionalism over a long time. I'm 75 years old now.
Yep.
Glad to see another gray hair in the picture here.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord. Bob lost his son, and I have to tell you this. I called him out of the blue. I needed to find something out, and he's a go-to guy. And he answers, and I said, "Hi, Bob, it's Charley Morgan. How you doing?" He says, "Well, considering that my son passed away last night," or whatever he did tell me. And boy, I just didn't know what to say to him. I don't even remember what to say, but what a tragic thing happened there. And my own son, my oldest son, died a couple of years ago at 62 or 61, just in the prime of his life. But anyway, you got the genuine article here, Bob. And I love the work you're doing these days too. A couple of those boats I would buy myself if I had some spare change right now.
I have a question for you. When you look back at all these boats, I know this is a hard question, but when you look back at the boats you admired, are there some that stand out that you say, I wish I'd have designed that boat?
Oh, well, there were a lot of boats that I really did like. I'm usually asked, by the way, I'll just stick this in that right now. I had designed a 54-footer called Rage, the last CCA boat that I designed. And she was thoroughly tank tested. And I enjoyed that boat so much. She sailed way above her rating. She won quite a few races, but badly sailed a lot of the time.
Well, what year was this?
Oh, that would have been 60, maybe about 67, somewhere in there.
What did tank testing cost you back then?
Tank testing?
Yeah.
Well, I think somewhere around $4,000, depending on what your test program was. It would be maybe $6,000, $7,000. If you already had a comparable boat to test against. The 60-footer we tested against Ray Hunt's boat for the British Prime Minister.
Drumbeat.
She had no external keel.
Beautiful boat.
Say again?
Beautiful boat.
Yeah, she was very well behaved boat. Meridia was the one I'm talking about, was my boat. And she beat everybody out of Tampa Bay the first race she was in. Good fresh breeze and just stormed the Bastille. Went around the world. She didn't perform well in the light air because, again, I tended to put smaller rigs on the CCA boats because they had big jennies and could do okay, but they were cruiser racers. And the more we aimed at racing machines, Rage was one of those, although she led the fleet in the Sydney Hobart race boat for boat for a very long time, and then broke her spar. Her spar was made, but we were up against all kinds of things. The biggest winch you could buy was a Luke coffee grinder, and maybe some of the early variant style winches, and a few were being built abroad at the time. But we had so much handmade turning blocks, and gear was just beginning to be, but the startup of the Vietnam War was underway. I guess in those times, and we had to make the spar for that boat. You could not buy off the shelf, out of stock, appropriate spar. So we used U-shaped channels that were highway guardrails. Somewhere out in California, we got available that. We welded those things up, tapered them, and made the spar a double spreader rig. And they got beating to windward off the Tasmanian Sea, and did not put the inner stay in, which they were supposed to do. I was not aboard, unfortunately. But when you again, back to the sea keeping, you need to go experience the conditions. What the hell happens when you reef down your main? The headboard is right there at the middle of the upper panel. So
Yeah.
it's trying to turn that mast inside out. And if you don't have something to stabilize the rig, well, you need to know those things if you're going to be putting up your storm sail. And once you've got one of those sails loose and beating things up, you're going to need to kill somebody or bust some other gear. So, but they broke this mast and put a telephone pole in that was available in Australia. But again, so much of what was being done in those earlier days, the resins, the sealants that we put together on decks or bedding compounds were just coming on. They would dry up and fall out. My first production boat was out in '65. My God, a long time ago. And so much has happened to improve the array of good things. And I followed very, very interested in Bob's late boats that were being, what did you call those 42 footers or that were
The carbon cutters?
fiber? carbon cutters, you call them?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, those boats. I was high-fiving you all the time. I hope you caught my high-five, and probably couldn't tell my hand. But those were, I mean, vacuum bagged, infused moldings, and think these are superior stuff. My God. And boy, I'm telling you, the nights I beat to windward with that 60-footer and would hit a sea in the Gulf Stream, my God, I was biting buttonholes in my breeches. I tell you, it would scare me to death because we laminated that skin ourselves, over a male plug and then smoothed it. But those were old methods, and she didn't have any sandwich in her. And we got peculiar results with the sandwich efforts, balsa core and the AirX. I used to give lectures on how we did the AirX, and gave special lectures to people who were trying to figure out how to overlap the bow and transom areas and special slender sections in a single skin over a male plug, and maintain the outside dimensions you wanted on the inside. We did all that on the lofted floor. Everything we did was virtually lofted full size Bob. Bob knows how to use battens and ducks, bless his heart. And
Got them all around here.
yeah, and he ran an apprentice thing here. What, you had a young girl and a young man that worked for you a little while back?
I've had all sorts over the years.
And, we had those young fellows come and go. I started as a young guy. I was gifted to have already learned drafting as a young fellow. But anyhow, somebody else got another question there. Wave your hand again. I didn't see it. Joe?
I'll open it up. I know we had a couple of new people that admitted in here, so just unmute yourself and ask a question. Otherwise, I'll ask one.
Sure, whatever.
Well, the one question, and we probably touched upon a bunch of these things, but tell us one of your most memorable sailing stories.
Sailing stories? Well, yeah, I've been harping a little bit about offshore capabilities. I went to Cuba on a little boat that had been built by a black fellow who chartered the boat for high school groups or anybody want to go sailing on a boat called Good Times 2. He died, and it was refurbished into a more yachty type of boat, and I made sails for it when I started sailmaking here in '53 in St. Pete, Florida. And I had never been to sea on that boat, but it was absolutely impossible to manage that boat in high winds. Had no idea about that. I knew the guy that designed it. He died shortly after I was a junior member of the Davis Island Yacht Club. And I never sailed on it to any length of time. But I built these sails, and I was invited to go on the boat to Cuba. And we got caught. The navigator made a mistake, and we wound up, I went to sleep. We're supposed to jibe the spinnaker and head for the glow of Havana. And so I said, well, it's time for me to take a little nap, and you guys wake me up when the moon goes down, like the navigator said. Well, they wake me up and said, Charlie, you've been to Cuba before? What is this city here on the... Well, the city was Mariel. We were so far to the east, and the spinnaker was still up, and the moon was up. I'll tell you about that in a second, but anyhow, I said, oh my God, get that chute down, jibe this boat, and get on the other tack, and we got to start going with the Gulf Stream up toward Havana, because the seas, by no sooner than we got into this location, I mean, the seas were breaking over the cliffs and spewing over the top. And I looked back, and we were in a bight. Well, you couldn't tack this boat. It would not tack in high winds and breaking seas. And the seas were so huge, and she would just pick up and slide sideways in one giant motion. And my God, I realized 1, 2, 3, 4 of these babies, we're going to be in really critical shape. So we tried to tack. She wouldn't tack. So we got rid of some of the headsail, which split. Brand new sails got flogged by the clew of another of the topsail, and bingo, we're in trouble. And I've realized we had to work our way out of this. So we actually ran off before it and got on the other jibe in order to get the boat offshore. Well, the funny reason that we didn't, the moon didn't set at the right time. This fellow thought he was the world's best celestial navigator, and he had stuck in his sea bag the previous year's Almanac. The other thing he did, he leaned against the mizzenmast, and he was giving us a lecture just before sundown on Arcturus being the third magnitude star, and he was going to shoot her. He leaned against the mizzenmast and took his section and shot the masthead light for Arcturus. Bob, can any of you imagine this? The guy he thought he had it, but he was really just kidding himself about his navigation abilities. But anyhow, so I went to sleep thinking they'd wake me up about 11:30, 12 o'clock, and I'd be on deck for the rest of the ride into Havana. But that was a very critical moment. And it was a completely unprepared boat for bad circumstances. Nothing was really bad other than it was blowing about 28 to 35 knots, and the boat didn't respond right. And we had these huge breaking seas because we were coming on soundings, and all of a sudden they just started breaking around us and heaving us sideways 20, 30 yards or more at a time. But I don't know. Sailing, I loved hard weather. I enjoyed hard weather and the ability of a boat to operate successfully. And probably, honestly, the most exciting thing to a young designer, I had helped Charles Hunt, who and I collaborated on using conic development underbodies and hulls, a plywood ocean racer called Brisotti, which we won our second in class in the 57 Cuba race, and later changed the designs around, monkeyed with them, and came up with that Feather 2, which won the Chicago Mackinac race. But the performance of Paper Tiger as a wholesome, fat, cruising type of boat, and then we won the Southern Circuit back to back with her, which got me the opportunity to sail on Columbia. And a lot of people thought it was our sails, and I made really great sails. We finally had gotten some very good fabrics available, and you could hold the shape and form, and heavy weather sailing depended a lot on that. And it had become in those days a very de rigueur to have a very tight head stay. I think we had about 6,500 pounds on our head stay, and we were doing a 10,000 pound load on Columbia, thinking the head stay made a lot. We later learned that slack head stays in light air and was a good thing to do, but for some boats. But when a new boat hits the water and you go out sailing and you know it's on its lines and it's behaving well, and not got bad characteristics. And we, over later years, I certainly was one of the ones that let the aesthetics get away from me, but there's nothing more beautiful than it. I remember talking to Corny Shields, and he said, now there's Black Watch. He said, now that's a shear line. And he looked at it, and I looked at it, and Olin was in the crowd at the moment. And yeah, that was a beautiful shear line. And when he got to Shields, I remember we went to look at the plug for the Shields, whatever the designation was, the Shields class they sail out of Newport.
I think a 22-foot water line.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're just lovely boats. And anyhow, I can't offhand say that there was any particularly memorable moment, but it's, as a designer and a builder, to see it float like you hoped it was, and just to look good. And I think that we got away from the aesthetics as we started getting into these plumb-bound boats. And so, but that's all right too, because they function beautifully. And some of the old, it's just a combination of thing. And Bob has got the eye, got the hand. He's done it right, and very attractive boats. And there's a lot of young people that came along over the years that did good jobs of it. And but I got out a 60-footer. My last IOR boat was 60 feet long, and it was kind of a plain Jane boat. It had a flush deck, 60 feet. It went like hell, big rig, and but it was not as pleasing a boat as the more classic hull forms and shapes, which I'm very strongly attached to.
That little Morgan 27 you did was a good looking boat.
Well, the Morgan 27, there was a thing that was, what a shocker that little boat was. It was the first time on the underbody side of things. It was a little Morse boat, a MORC boat, and had a lot of adaptations to make it float the way we needed to. So the little swept keel to keep in the draft, but the bulb where it needed to be. And there was no resistance to bulbs under the MORC rule. I think there was actually a CCA rule against bulb keels. But that little boat was, we used to call it Abbott and Costello airfoil section book out there a minute ago.
Yeah.
She was a slender body theory boat. And the night we test drove it, I had one or two of the boys from the engineering department with me, and by cracky, that boat scared me. I didn't think this thing was going well because it was not making any fuss. And there was a slop off of in the Gulf where we were testing and sailing her. And we came upon another boat preparing for the Southern Circuit. It was about a 40-footer, and we just sailed right by him on the wind. And she just went and just went through it. But it was such a easily handled boat, and it was for MORC, and it was the beginning of the type of boats that the IOR rule or the Royal Ocean Racing rule was doing, but without so much pinched ends and other fat bellies. But, well, when some of the boats came out, we used to say they had tumors on their bellies and their ends were pinched. I think did I say who it was? I guess maybe I was talking to Joe yesterday. A guy came in from bringing a boat back from the Bahamas of the IOR kind, and he called me on the phone when he was checking in with customers. He says, "Morgan, don't ever design one of these IOR boats. I feel like a ping pong ball in a snare drum." And but they were all these first boats, and I guess they are quite a bit more noisy. All of the plastic boats are much more noisy. And you bang into, you go fast and you bang into an odd shaped sea and you get a noise out of it. But I would say, as a sailing machine, my feeling about Rage, which was a very successful boat. But just the response to her, you just reach up and get a handful of helm and you can feel the surge. And that's a good feeling, ain't it, Bob?
I did a couple of IOR 2-tonners. They're just beautiful boats to drive.
Yep.
Fingertip light helm.
Well, they got straightened out in the 60-footer I did good. Gosh, I remember we just whipped the butt off of running toilet, as we used to call her, a 60-footer that was Olin's boat, and a damn good boat. And we drove her so hard that we went beyond common sense and got a cold front settled down on us. Running 14 knots or so, and rolled her down in the middle of the night off of Nassau. Yeah. So got some more questions there. Joe, stir them up. I think they're going.
I'll go again.
Good, okay.
I was going to ask you about catches and what you saw the future is, but now that I have you and I know your familiarity with the Bahamas and the Keys, and actually the first boat I ever went to Bimini on was a Morgan 28, and we survived. So that's testament to the boat, not to our skills. And if you were designing an underbody now to go to the Keys and the Bahamas, what would you do, and what would your max and minimum draft be?
Well, I might have a little less forward overhang, and it would have maybe anything I took off the forward end a little bit clearer overhang aft, but a low slope one. I probably would have a shoal draft boat with a centerboard in the outside lead keel, bolted on keel. And the reason for that is you're not going to be grinding up on coral heads much of the hull if you go aground with your keel. The lead is a very, let me tell you, work hardened lead is pretty hard stuff. And if you go banging around on a coral reef, you are actually, raw lead is a good thing to have on the bottom of your boat. I worried a lot about grounding, and I would be typically doing keel sections that were not particularly laminar flow, but they would be thicker sections with wide low drag buckets, just so that you could get the lead where you needed to put the lead and get it down below the floors. And the boats would be pretty wide. I don't think I would be as wide stern as they're doing these days, just for aesthetic reason probably, but if you were saying it was a boat, well, the banker used to tell us that our Morgan 34 was all the yacht a man needs to own. He'd wave hands at us, he'd go nuts, when he'd be looking at our cleared balances on a daily level. He'd say, "You guys are nuts," when we were getting up and running. He said, "That's all the boat." We were talking about doing a bigger boat, bigger models, and that was in the early stages. But for that size of boat, I would give design everything around the human ergonomic side of it, so that they were nice boats to live aboard, comfortable to sleep on, had plenty of stability for a good breeze at 20-degree heel, so to speak. I'd work all of that out very meticulously so that it wasn't freaking out the kids or your wife or girlfriend or whatever, just because it breezed up in the afternoon. We get a good northwester over here in the afternoons. It would be 12, 14, 15, 18 knots. And, that's a hatful of wind for about a 20-degree heel or something. But it would be geared around those kind of things in a cockpit that was comfortable. And the side decks, so at the cabin house, you know, you could lean back against it and with your feet over the rail and lean back against it and enjoy sailing. A lot of that kind of thing, and probably a little taller rig with a little shorter booms and place the mast. Of course, you've always got this problem. And where you place the mast in terms of the head, and the head would be large enough for a woman back. We used to, Bob, on the Morgan 34, believe you me, we had a girl that was, we used to call her double wide. She worked on our switchboard, and we loved her. She was a sweetheart. But it was back in the days, picture this, back in the days when women were wearing panty girdles. Picture a panty girdle. So we built a plywood mock-up of the M34 head, installed the head in it, had dual openings to the head, and told her to go in there and close the doors and take her panty girdle on and off. So help me, that happened, to be able to be sure that that head was large enough, and then we fitted. And I was 6'2.5" at the time, and wanted to see that at least on the diagonals of the forward berth, a 6'6" guy could lie down there and be comfortable. But when you've done those things, that's a good size of boat, and it should be meeting what you need to be comfortable and enjoy the boat.
That's a great looking boat too.
Well,
The
yeah,
34.
yeah, and they were sweet boats to sail, and they came out with bronze centerboards. Of course, it was again the build up for the Vietnam War, so we had Monel water tanks in them originally. We had bronze centerboards, and we had to give up the bronze centerboards because you couldn't. And we had beautiful little stainless steel as standard equipment in the beginning, and we couldn't get the stainless steel soap, so we just had to let people find what they could without raising the prices. It was a hard job. We just barely stayed alive building those boats. But I owned one or two of them over the years, and they had a lot of neat features about the stylization of the kind of. We had little whales at the going around the what do we call those things? On the deck, they were fashion pieces around the edge, like if you have a laid deck, but it elevated the look at that thing. that was the U-shaped bows of 12 meters that were so extant these days. That was that underwater area where the I used the word a while ago, Bob, I can't, stagnation point, like on the windshield of a car if you've got a curved windshield. Anyhow, but the idealization of these things to make the boat. One thing that we had trouble doing, we used so many atomic 4 engines in the first boats. Those were cheap and they were easy to maintain. They were enough to drive those smaller boats well, and but you still need to be able to service those things. And we got everybody in the business, it seemed like, started trying to incorporate too much in the boats, and made it hard to service the plumbing and the systems. And we didn't have the kind of tinned wiring in the beginning that's now de rigueur for wiring and other internals. And the plumbing system, we did a thing that could be called a mistake. but it was intended to be easier for people to service their boats. We knew that people didn't take care of their boats as much as they should, so we didn't put ball joints in. We used bronze hardware and bronze valves that you could buy in a hardware store in the islands, as opposed to a ball and socket type of valve for certain through hull fittings and so on. But that would be the kind of aim I would have for that size of boat. And the good thing about the cruising club rule, at least for the time, those times, it was designed around wooden boats, and 35-footer, 34-footer would not in wood would not give you the usable space, particularly if you had a centerboard trunk up in the in the main cabin. So we adopted, I don't know who brought on that jackknife blade centerboard, unless it was Worth Monroe from Coconut Grove or Bill Tripp. But when I got into the scheme of things, it was being adopted by those guys. And we were able to put our centerboard trunks below the sole, so that you walked down and came down a companionway, you had a wide open berth with 2 huge quarter berths to sleep in, and nice forward stateroom. So it worked out fine. It was a successful model.
Yeah, the 2 different Robins I sailed on, the trips, not the trips, not trip,
Hood.
but the
Hood.
hoods had the jackknife.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, they helped. It helped balance the boats. I've got a picture somewhere of my own checkmate, of Morgan 34 blasting along on a reach. And she was manageable. One thing you have to remember about the centerboards, when you start bringing the centerboard up, you're increasing its stability. How's that? Because you bring up the center of lateral plane, the overturning moment to roll is reduced. And so it helped in stabilizing, plus it also balanced the boats when you were driving off with a little better than 2-to-1 ratio mainsail. So bring them on, Joe.
Who's got questions?
Hi, Joe.
I'll go.
Jump. If you don't mind, Mr. Morgan, I know that you are active in the local arts community. Did you ever get involved in the aeronautical industry of any sort? Thank you.
Well, actually, I had hoped to be an aeronautical engineer, and I drifted into sailmaking as a way of making more money than working for the local telephone company. And then the next thing I know, I was helping make boats go faster just by tuning them up and aerodynamically correcting sails and things like that. And when I say aerodynamically correcting, there were many wrong bits of information about slot effects and all kinds of things. The slot effect was maintaining flow as opposed to stalled flow. But it was, all of those technologies were swiftly moving ahead, and they were ahead of us because they had mainframe computers, and the war effort brought a huge improvement in the knowledge of the aeronautical side of the equation. But I did not finish a technical education because I got into business and scared hell out of myself with that process, and wound up making it work. But I've been an avid student of aerodynamics and the evolution of it. I just gave to my 12-year-old grandson my my two books that were the Bibles for aeronautical people by Dr. Herner and Borscht, which were the fluid mechanics of drag and the fluid dynamics of lift. And they were compendiums that were developed after World War II. The German engineers that had been way ahead of the Americans through their glider and sailplane activities brought on so much knowledge, and they created these compendiums of all known at the end of the war, particularly the aerodynamic drag. And I had gone to school with a doctor of physics who I sailed with. He was a sailor, and I stayed close to the aeronautical side of things because I was a pilot. I had numbers of airplanes over the years and liked to fly, and kept up with it. But more recently, I worked for the last 4 or 5 years with people, a little cluster of us that were interested in fixed wing, high speed, small drone aircraft, and which has been fascinating, and use the Tesla batteries for their propulsion and onboard inertial system guidance, navigation. And I got into it because of my background in composite construction and engineering, and also the aeronautical side of it, because you run into the aircraft people say at Boeing, you've got the configuration people, then you've got the people that need to have the per seat or per mile efficiency, and you got the structural guys that get into the middle of it, and you've got all of those considerations. And so trying to package these things into small planes, and it's amazing how fast they can go. And of course, I've only done 2 government jobs in my history, and prefer not to be involved in any of it at all. But these planes were more that we've been working on are to be dumped from the, not the tropopause, but somewhere around 25,000 feet or so out of a C-117 or C-17, whatever they are, and a C-130 to help gather intelligence. They're not kinetically intended, at least the ones we're working on. And I've bowed out of that now with my wife's condition. I just can't spread myself that thin. But the command and control of those aircraft and the mission, I mean, they're intended to fly it like a hawk. I mean, a dove avoiding hawks, and emit signals that make them think that they're much larger than they are, and all kinds of technological, electronic sides of it. The big bugaboo in those things is now trying to figure out how to avoid the electromagnetic blasts that can be imposed on them by the enemy radar. But I do. We've learned so much about going fast. When you think about the catamarans or the foil boats, they're operating on the one hand at low speed aerodynamics at the masthead of one of these things going 40 knots. That's still just liftoff speed for a Cessna 150, let's say. But you're operating at speeds that in the juncture of the foils is boiling off with cavitation. And when you see them bucking like they do from time to time, or stuffing their noses, all of a sudden they lose the aerodynamic or hydrodynamic lift of the foil, is interrupted momentarily in the overturning moment of the sail, pitches and causes. Those are big forces when you start going at you're probably Mach 1, close to what would be equivalent to Mach 1. Bob, do you know what kind of speeds, relative speeds those are on these foils? Depending on the width of them, they're very, their Reynolds number is very low because of the short cord, but even at those speeds, it runs on up. But it's all very fluid mechanics, fluid dynamics.
40 miles an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the bigger ones. There's some big ones out there now. I don't know how fast, but I suspect 50 knots.
Yeah, it is. I mean, but remember the old interface, the ancient interface society, Not Your Way. I used to go up to Stanford and sit with those heroes, and it's an amazing thing. But in the turn of those fins, you're operating at the equivalency of a Mach 1 somewhere in there. And that's it. You know, we got into these crazy things about these swing keels or these long, slender lifting bodies with a huge bulb on the bottom of it, just the inertial forces of a boat operating in the surface versus the twisting and the normal elasticity of a big steel membrane holding that lead. You're waving that thing around. So the aeroelastic properties of it, I remember. Did you ever know Walt Scott by any chance, Bob?
No.
Walt's looking at us and listening to us up there. His pictures on the wall behind me. He was an aeronautical engineer for Grumman, and a wonderful guy. He was a great sailor and had a naval architectural degree from Webb out on the island. But anyhow, so much has gone on. Now, the accuracy of all of the calculations, the accuracy of the drawings,
Did you ever do a stability study by hand?
oh God.
I mean, people can't imagine
I
how
see
much
it.
work
Watch this. Look at, you can see Bob there. He brings up a question like this, and my answer is those are hair hurting problems. But to do it, I've got into the art game because I never had time to study art. So when my middle wife died at 60, I said, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do with myself. I'm going to go paint for a while. And I got involved with a living master to build a sculpture that was 90 feet long, and it hangs over the concourse in Airside Sea out here in Tampa. And I copied a big wing rib, a 24 series wing rib I used to have a Beechcraft stagger wing aircraft that was restoring. And we had a rib out of that. So we used that as the model for this thing. But we weighed every bit of that thing so that we knew exactly what it weighed before we hung it, because it was going in over a public concourse. And the engineers from the I don't know what agency was looking over that, to tell you the truth. But anyway, it was an engineer who was following everything I was doing about it. He finally told him it was supposed to hang on one rod. And I said, well, that'd be fine. We can do that. But when you turn those air conditioners on and off, the air handlers, it will make that thing spin. So you either have to have constraining apparatus, or you're going to have a bulge, that's a maintenance thing that have to be looked at regularly. So they decided to put it up on 2 wires. Anyway, we do exactly what it weighed. But to answer Bob's question, did I ever do one? I did the closest one I could on that, because I could weigh all the pieces and parts ahead of time. And
I'm not talking about a weight study. I don't even want to think about weight studies.
yeah,
I'm not, did you ever do a stability study by hand?
we did that once we got PC things. But I did stability studies by hand based on what I could calculate, and using some empirical data, and the old tried and true thing of balancing. I used large scale drawings for the sections, expanded them, I think, a double or triple times depending on the size, and then used Mylar or really acetate sheets to paste them up to find the exact flotations. And then I created curves of stability to did our best as we could. And then I was here on the docks as a kid when they introduced the inclination experiment, and had a chance to work with a British genius scientist here in town who had a 40-foot Finisterre type boat that Stevens had designed. And he showed me a lot about how to do those things. And once you establish the slope of the curve, you can interpolate pretty carefully once you have another model to compare against. But that was the big problem. So he used the moment of inertia of the waterline plane as a major factor. But we just had to do estimates of it, and we had boats to incline that had similar characteristics. And that was about all we were really doing. But on Paper Tiger, we did mathematical models of her weight distributions. And the boat, the 60-footer that I was talking about, we went over to Canaveral, the rocket guys, who were all excitedly looking into a yacht design problem. They were inertial guidance, put people in inertial. That was their middle names, it seemed like. We introduced into their mainframes over there at one of the companies that was in the Radiation Inc. was developing equipment for flying to the moon and the rockets to the moon and so on. We created an image of a regular sea with various angles of a sailing yacht's attack to it, where we followed this. Most of those keel centerboarders of that time had center of gravities that were just below or right around the waterline. And so we traced that waterline, that's center of buoyancy, center of gravity, equilibrium, in these waves at different angles, and knew the polar moments from measuring the boat, Paper Tiger, after the fact, and used them in the design of the 60-footer to describe the amplitude and frequency of the encountered seas, or the impedance. We were trying to determine the impedance from the encountered seas on the buoyancy of the boats, and it got very elaborate, but we determined that you needed to make everything in the boat infinitely light to a centroid that had very low couples, both laterally and fore and aft pitching. And to try and stop I remember passing a New York 40, a New York 40, Stevens, New York 40, 32, New York 32, Olin Stevens design. Beautiful, graceful boats, good boats. Mustang.
Oh, yeah, Mustang.
Olin's brother Rod had one for years. And this boat was plunging in the Gulf Stream. Just before dark, we passed her and just sailed right up to her and right beyond her. And she was reefed. We had a so-called flattening reef in, and the #1 Jenny, heavy Jenny, and with a scoop leach and all the things you would do for heavy weather, and banged on through the night. But we passed her, and she was plunging so badly. We got in, and I had a long talk with Ted Hood's dad. We beat Ted Hood Bossbacker and director sailing a Hood boat. Both of them were Hood designs.
You were sailing Paper Tiger?
Say again?
You were sailing Paper Tiger?
I was, yeah.
Yeah.
And we beat those boats. And I talked to Ted's dad because we beat Ted in by close to an hour. And he was always a great measuring stick because everything he did was usually very well done and to the best of their abilities. He had crack crew, and I knew some of those guys. But we got to talking about the advantage of a centerboarder in those kind of conditions versus a keel boat where you kick the bow up into the air and you got a big portion of the lead stuck down out here. And so the harmonics or the pitching periods of those things just amplified themselves. But you got in the wrong kind of seas, you started just doing this. And you've all done it. If any of you've done a lot of sailing, you know these things, but the centerboarder doesn't jack it gets its stability elsewhere. And it doesn't. And so Paper Tiger could just hurl herself almost from one sea to the next one in some of those short, steep seas. We had a 7-inch Kelvin White or whoever it was compass, and we had it. That thing would just spin. We'd hit a sea so hard, and it was scary to me for sure, because I just worry about something on the boat busting.
Yeah.
But this is the beginning of the ability of other designers, not only himself, and I don't know who all was there, but I know a guy that was really studying that was Lowell North, who was studying it because of the pitching moment's effect on sails. I mean, when you cannot have an idealized sail shape when it's moving fore and aft,
Oh,
back and forth. So who the hell are you kidding if that thing is stalled part of the time and it's got the wrong angle of attack and everything is just, it's useless area. And we proved that by this this British scientist that lived here. We broke the code on the rule by testing with just a system set up. We had a vane to keep us sailing at a steady angle of attack, and we tested the mainsail down, we tested the mainsail with a reef, we used the same Jenny to mark the sheets, and we had a Vita root counter counting the water used, and we made an anemometer out of toilet bowl floats and had it spinning on a Vita root counter on the nose on a gimbal. So we were using wind used and water by, and just keeping it within a framework of a range of wind velocities by testing with that little hand anemometer. We'd book that thing every couple of minutes and sail for 30 minutes, and unless the wind died off or changed, we got a good statistically important or significant reading. We did a lot of that kind of work, but it was hair hurting again and time consuming and very difficult for, as I say, I was suffering profitless prosperity as a sailmaker, but I was having a lot of fun. But the finding out about, I know the 12 meters moved the spars back a little further. Ocean racers, I was sticking to the masthead rigs and moving the mast back a little further.
on a typical 12 meter, when that boat was built and launched, how much latitude did you have at the base of the mast to move the mast fore and aft?
Well, we had a lot of room. Funny thing, they allowed me to put in an aluminum mast step arrangement. They would not let me use aluminum for the strength ribs that the Scantling rules for Lloyd's required at the mast area. At the aft end of the cockpit, I think we had a steel rib. There were 2 ribs in the way of the mast. There was a smaller steel rib forward, I think. I'm pretty confident of that. They wouldn't let us make those out of aluminum. We were using a lot of aluminum, 6061 T6 aluminum. They wouldn't let us do that. And I said, well, we got aluminum masts. We understand the science for the aluminum and everything. I said, nope, you can't do it. But they let me build a mast step, which provided for shifting the spars. We had the dog bone that picked up the whole cluster of the shrouds, which was flexible and it flipped inboard so that the jetty could come in tighter. And so what we did with those steel ribs was we cut those out of 4130 steel, I guess that was, and coated them with zinc paint after we heat treated them. So we were able to show that they had the strength requirement of common steel, but were less weight. And we had the ability to change the chain plate locations just by pulling the pin and moving the dog bone fore and aft. We didn't have the appropriate part. Interesting thing about Columbia and some of the models we tested in the 12-meter world had a tendency after they were footing appropriately, going to windward at a 30-degree heel, they tend to want to wander off to the lee. Columbia
Well, you know, well, I'd read somewhere that at least one 12-meter about that they could move the mast 6 feet fore and aft, which seems
we didn't have any facility to do that, and we had done enough testing on shifting of the centers of effort and so on, the lateral plane, rather centers of effort with reference to the lateral plane in the test tank. And the only person I knew that had that, I think Enterprise was the one that Lowell North was sailing later, or the aluminum boat. It had Lowell he was an aeronautical engineer, and I think actually maybe a mechanical engineer. And he was a great innovator, and his star boats were, I sailed with him some in the stars occasionally, and he was an innovator, testing one boat against another boat. I did testing for the North Loft with my setup over here. They would ship me 9 jibs, and I would go out and test them with a fixed arrangement on my twin matched pair of Italian stars. And we learned a lot, but the mystery of it was what was the real significant difference in these different sails. But we would test just jibs or test just mainsails against known jibs that had not been through high winds and beat them up and change their shapes. And we had, I had a walkie-talkie system, and we would test. We had the windows in the star mains, and we would have little marks in the windows, so we would hook up sufficiently far apart. And I carried weights in the back of my station wagon, so I could put them over the side with some teenager that was a crack helmsman to use the other boat. And you would line up and put the crosshairs on the shrouds of the other boat on the tick marks on your window, and just test one simple thing for as long as you could. And the moment you knew that there was a significant difference for, say, 2 or 3, 4 minutes run, you would stop, swap jibs, get a new jib, whatever, keep one of them the same. And that's what they did. I saw a film made by one of the videographic companies of the setup that they used on the Kiwi 12 meters that had telemetry and the big black bands on the sails, and they would shoot up from the boom as a reference. And they would test these things and feed them on shore and do things and test one boat against the other boat, one boat against the other boat. And that's what we did with stars, and that's what those guys did over there until they got fast. And you cannot get fast until you find those sweet spots.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to go, Charlie.
Well, you getting hungry?
Yes.
Bob, anytime you want to talk about any of these things that's on your mind, give me a call, because I'm an old man now.
Yeah.
Damn it.
Too.
And thankfully, but
Okay.
you know, you're another age group, you know, going through the stream of things that are changing. And I hope you keep up the kind of work you're doing. And your group that, Joe, I don't know how many people are. There's a number of Morgan groups, and I don't participate like you do, Bob, or maybe you don't participate as much as I think you do, but it's wonderful that you're doing that and passing on what you know. And you're, again, the genuine article. You're not an egocentric cat that,
Try to be.
well, you always grin when you're doing it.
Yeah. All right,
But
Charlie.
I'm serious about it.
Thank you very much.
And I need to vacate all these things that it's been a long time for me. And I got invited into and husbanded along by some very wonderful men and people that were pure scientists. I didn't have the intellect to go along with that, but my God, did I ever appreciate it, and the kindness that was visited on me as a kid that just was a dreamer. And I like to innovate and try things like all of us do that are in this crazy game.
Yeah.
God bless you again.
Thanks, Charlie. I'll see you later.
All right. Don't fail to call me when you want to.
I will certainly call you.
And
Thank
thanks
you.
all of you for participating. This was fun. I really enjoyed it, and I wish I got to know you better. Thumbs up. Let the good times roll.
Hey,
Thank you.
Charlie,
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks for doing it, Joe. I know it's been a bit of a hassle to put it all together, but it's fun. It's a great innovation. This is how my grandson is taking all of his courses these days, and he's a young, bright kid. But this is a great system to stay in touch and pass news along.
hey, Charlie,
All right.
hey, Charlie, Jody Colbert here.
Yes, sir.
I tried typing in a question in the chat thing, but apparently you didn't see that. My question was, if you got time,
Sure.
what led to the changes on Heritage after the America's Cup when she got modified?
Well, she was modified. I gave her to the Florida Institute of Technology and got to meet Ed Teller, the atomic bomb hero, by doing that. But I was hoping to establish a naval architectural chair at the Florida Institute of Technology over on the other coast. And they turned that into an ocean engineering effort. But the changes they made, the boat was sold to a guy named Wildman from Chicago. Bill, I think it was Bill Wildman. And he wanted to ocean racer. And he got somebody to modify the underbody, take off the original keel, put a new keel on that was an IOR type of keel, and brought it down for the Southern Circuit, and I think maybe some ocean racing. And I had hoped, in a later life, the boat would be available for ocean racing. I think maybe that was the reason I kept the butt end of her a little bit wider than I would today. Her keel would have been shortened to 4.5. But yeah, it was modified, and they reduced its displacement and stability because the stability was measured under the IOR rule. So they raced her under the IOR. She set records on the Great Lakes. Some of them, I think, maybe stand. Probably doubt it, because they got into some different types of boats that could plane. That was the principal thing they did, though. They put a new keel on her, reduced the total amount of ballast, and put a masthead rig on her at one time. And then they went back to the 12-meter rig she's on now. I went up to sail as a guest aboard during the Leukemia Cup, sailed under IOR rule about 6 years ago now, 5 years ago, and she won her division against some of the newer 12s. I don't know how all that rating part was handled, but she sailed well. They had plenty of new sails on her and was sailing regularly at the time. But that's most of what was done to her. They put a spade rudder on her. Incidentally, I wanted to put a spade rudder while I was doing the tank test work, and I was advised against that by the scientists at the Stevens Institute at the time. And it probably would have helped a good bit in the starting processes. Those small rudders on the 12s were not what you really needed for the pre-start maneuvering. All right, anybody else?
Charlie, reason I brought that up is I was fortunate enough to race on Heritage, and I forget what year they brought it down for the Caribbean Ocean Racing Triangle or Circuit or whatever it was that year,
Right, yes.
and also Antigua Race Week, and that was the most fun I've ever had. I got to thank you for just a wonderful.
Well, the 12s are great boats to sail. I mean, they're a lot of fun. I mean, you don't get the acceleration for reaching off and driving under the chute, but I've seen her putting up spray from her chain plates that are, look like gushers. And by the way, something I didn't remark on, I did refer to the fact that we still were using snaps in 62 on Genoa jibs, but we were also using, in 62, we were using 5/16 diameter galvanized plow steel for the Genoa sheets. And you want to talk about some dangerous stuff is plow steel. When it starts getting some of the fangs breaking loose on it, it would eventually break. And we would use up one running backstay in any race. It was a good bit of wind. We had to replace them every day because the stainless steel just couldn't handle the tension on the small blocks and around the winches. It would just start breaking down. Interesting thing about materials, but by the time we got around to the 1970 sailing, where we had really great nylon or whatever plastic material it was that we were using for sheets in those days.
Well, Charlie, Don Wildman joined us for, I guess, BVI Regatta and Antigua. And as memorable as sailing on Heritage was, he was even more memorable. Did you get to know Don Wildman much?
Well, I knew him, yeah, and talked to him frequently for a period of time there. I don't know what Don's doing these days. I think maybe he's older than I am. I don't know. I haven't heard.
The last I heard on Don was that he and Laird Hamilton, the god of Hawaiian surfer boys, the guy that invented toe-in surfing, he and Don had come up with a electric surfboard golf cart.
No kidding. I'll be that. Well, he was quite an interesting man, and I was glad to see him buy the boat from Florida Institute of Technology and get her sailing. I had hoped, though, that they would keep her as a 12-meter, but it was fun to see what they did. She lost the mast. She ran aground coming in Egmont Key, got the North Passage here on the sand bottom, and just the in a fog at night, and they were trying to get out of the current and ran around to the bottom with a spinnaker up, and everything went right over the nose. And I had a shop where I was keeping my racing stars next to another shop, and I looked in the door there one day and I saw all this ribbon rigging that was on it, and a piece of spar I recognized immediately. So what the hell is this? And so the guy had been fishing for sharks out there, and he hooked onto part of the rig that they just cut away, brought up the scrap of it, and put in his shop. But Don campaigned the boat quite regularly there for a while, and then she went out west, and then she came back, and one man owned her for 23 years and kept her up himself. He was in the real estate business, and spent a lot of time around Newport, and kept the boat going. And then she's been through a couple of owners since. I don't know that I've been in touch with the people that do own her now, and they say she's dry as a bone, and is being, well, I guess she's probably hauled out of the water right about now. But she's been day sailing up there with the rest of the 12s. And I guess they're about ready to have the North American Championships of 12 meters right about maybe in November. Forget what the story is on that.
Well, my money's on Heritage, and one thing I want to bring up was when she was down in the Caribbean, she was racing under the West Indies rating rule. Did you ever design a boat to the West Indies rule, or are you familiar with it?
No, I'm not. But there were many features of. I worked with this scientist, British scientist, here trying to evolve a time-on-time rating rule as opposed to the time on distance based on the old Harrisoff time allowance tables that were used for many years. I don't know what they did there, but
well, it must have suited Heritage and everything, because we were sailing almost boat for boat with the UBS Switzerland, which was, I guess, originally a Marlboro, the Maxi.
Well, she was limited by displacement, so any displacement hull she would be, her near her waterline, she would be certainly able to stay pretty close to them. The distances that these 12 meters were losing one to another, you have a long beat to windward, and aside from covering tactics and that type of thing, sometimes we just had long broads one way or another and just be up there closing in on the weather mark with just mere seconds apart. So they were all the speed differences were more attuned to differences in the wind velocity. Some were much faster in lighter airs than the high winds.
Well, we had basically a three-boat race in Antigua. The other boat besides UBS was Mistress Quickly, which could get up and plane off the wind in the big seas. And it was some of those downwind legs between the three boats. They were three totally different types of boats. But God, we were just neck and neck and swapping leads on every swell.
Yep. Well, it's interesting. I know that when they were sailing the boat up north, I had injured my right knee, and was in a cast, so they sailed the boat up, and they got in a small, they told me, a mini hurricane, but it was blowing really hard one night with a free sheet off Hatteras, and they ran away from a sport fisherman that was husbanding her tender. They got about 18 or 20 miles ahead of their tender overnight. Anybody else got some more questions?
I got about 2 or 3 more minutes before I gotta grab the kids from school. So, but for me personally, I appreciate the time, Charlie. Awesome.
Well, I enjoy it. It's great to talk shop, and I as usual, people quite often hesitate to ask questions, and it's endless when you get a guy like Bob together with people like me or 2 or 3 others, that. So the thing to do is don't be shy about asking the questions, because we love to talk boats.
Okay, one more while we have the chance then. It's in the 40-foot range, with the understanding that like sail handling gear has gotten a lot better. And other than aesthetic reasons, is there a reason to build a ketch still?
Well, it's going to be what are you going to use the boat for?
I'm going from distance sailing.
Okay. Well, boy, a ketch rig is the way to go. You can well design a good ketch. Let's picture this. Let's say you're going to Georgetown in the Bahamas.
Exactly.
And so you arrive at night, and you've never been into Georgetown. And so you get nearby and you say, boy, at this rate, we're going to be there at pitch black, and we're going to have to stand offshore. So we used to take boats back and forth after the racing with a yawl or a ketch rig. And you take your choice of headsail arrangements. But there's nothing like putting up a deck awning, dropping the main, and slowing down, cooking dinner, being upright in the cockpit, chugging along without getting to the opening in the dark. And so you wind up being having a very useful platform. Another thing, if you want to be standing on your feet and reaching, is take down the main, put up the deck awning, and set the mizzen staysail to the leeward shrouds, and set the mizzen staysail and go trucking along with plenty of sail up, and you're going virtually hull speed. And you're standing on your feet again, easy to navigate. You don't have everything tumbling around inside. And yes, sir, I would go for it. That's the rig that was on Paper Tiger, by the way. She had a catch proportion, a masthead rig, and a mainsail that was easy to handle and hard going. And of course, everybody should be using a good system of reefing as opposed to anything like a rotor furling system.
So my boat for the Bahamas is Paper Tiger. It's a centerboard catch rig.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. As she went over there many times, and she went down the islands and she went up the coast and never did go abroad, which they thought they would do. The man's health didn't hang in there that long. He was already almost.
Hey, Richard, now that you're driving, can you go pick up my kids?
I just got mine. Where are yours?
Oh, Lordy. Well, what's this? I see 12 US 62. What was she? 62. Canon. I don't remember that name.
She's the old Plastic Fantastic. She's the old Kiwi Magic.
No kidding.
No kidding.
So you're racing out of Newport.
I haven't been on this boat since the mid-90s. But yes, it was in Newport.
Yeah, okay. So she says she's got wing keels, so right?
Yeah, she's now she's one of Cato's boats. His. So the boat changed hands maybe once or twice since I've sailed on it.
Yeah. Very quick boat.
Yes, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, see, those lighter boats had more alacrity. These heavy boats got ponderous, and only when I remember the last time I sailed against Intrepid was out the torpedo range in Newport, and it was blowing hard, and we were blocked up on the wind, and we were easily handling her. But it was 18, 20 knots of breeze. We were testing against her, and but the lighter boats, you know, that were sufficiently stable, it made a big difference.
The one thing you learn quick on those 12 meters is the danger, as you were talking about, of those the steel jib sheets.
Yeah,
Because if they don't tell you what's going on, because they're going to chuckle, and you go across the deck fast and you catch them on your ankles.
oh Lord. I remember a Merriman block that was being used for a turning block, a little snatch block, and I told her, I said, you better watch that. That's going to get somebody someday. And sure enough, in one of the feeder races for the circuit, he had that thing broken, hit him in the knee, and he had a lot of trouble with that knee afterwards. Well, anyway, this has been great. I'd be happy to answer any of these questions anymore if you got them, and if Joe can hang around. But I think it's great to see your fan club going, and keep it up. And it all helps everybody understand what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. But yeah, I'd go for that catch rig any day. It's not ideal in some ways. On the other hand, for distance racing, you can stay up on your feet a lot of times just by taking the main down. Coming back from Cuba, we left Veradero, Cuba, put the deck awning up, had the jib, the mizzen staysail, blowing about 30, 32 knots, something like that, and the Spitfire jib up, swung out, and the boat just sailed herself across the stream. We didn't have anything to do but sit there and drink beer and some basically cristal or whatever we were drinking. And it's a good seagoing rig. You can manage it. And when you take the big main down, without the deck awning and high winds, you still can stand up on your feet and go to windward well and not be too wet, not too uncomfortable.
Thank you for the vote of confidence in the rig selection. Now I just have to have Bob to draw it for me.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of systems for that. I hear I've got a fellow that owns a retired major down in Key West that uses autopilot and so on. He's live aboard and living out his retirement down there. A great guy, great hero, and he uses a autopilot, goes single-handing solo a lot of the time. Yeah, it's a good system. Joe, rattle the cage again, buddy.
No, the key just rattled, man. I gotta go, guys.
I knew you were a fader, Joe. God bless you for putting it together.
Charlie, it was a pleasure.
This is
Absolute
working.
pleasure.
This is working out well. I think you can do these kind of things forever. And by the way, Chuck Payne is another guy that's was on with you last time, I guess, or the time before. Yeah. He is the real article too, believe me.
We're gonna, me and Bob talked briefly about getting Chuck on the Zoom, so hopefully we'll get that to happen, make that happen.
Let's get some of these other guys up and embarrass them.
Absolutely.
Come up with the embarrassing questions.
All right.
All right, guys.
All right. Have a great afternoon, Charlie.
Thank you.
Smooth sailing. So long, Joe.
So long. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Goodbye, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.